Okay, everybody, I'd like to call the meeting of the Licensing Committee of the Board of Psychology back into session. And the first thing that we need to do today is have a roll call to make sure we have a quorum present.
Horn?
Present?
Jones?
Here?
Phillips? Aye.
Aye. Okay, everybody, since we did not get through with everything that was on our agenda item yesterday, which was the pathways to licensure, but because we have talked about today being the focus on the continuing professional development regulations, what we're going to do is hold, if we have time left at the end of the day to finish the agenda items on the pathways to licensure, we'll do that, or finish reviewing the pathways to licensure. But we're going to take the continuing professional development first. Okay. And then before we get started, item B on today's agenda, the CPD CE summary verification form, or this isn't attached in today's agenda. We're going to take those out and not consider those, because last time we met, we actually decided what the appropriate verification would be, and so it would be too much of an effort, I think, to try to change these forms, and we may have to think of another way to do it. So we're just not going to consider those verification forms in that at all. And then for the next time we meet, or before these go into final regulation, I think we want to see forms and we want to do it, but that won't be part of our reg package. So. All right, so the first thing I want to do is ask, based on what we did the last time, which as we start looking, it's all the language from page 2 through the top of page 11, about a third or fourth of the way down page 11. Mm-hmm. So in the language that we have already taken a look at, is there anything at this point that, after further review, that you think we're missing, we need to clarify, we need to add, subtract, anything like that?
I just had one comment, and that was in looking at acceptable CPD learning activities on page 4, about a third of the way down the page. Mm-hmm. It talks about a self-directed study. I think that inadvertently got rolled into and kind of disappeared into CE, whereas I think that was an area that we wanted to have as a separate function that people could do in order to gain these hours, if I'm recalling correctly.
Yeah, I think you're right, and actually this came up, and I want to say this and thank, we had Dr. Karen Shore who sent us a letter. I think she's going to be here today. While I'm at it, let me just, if anybody's watching, I want to thank people who did take time to send in their comments to us about these items, or their concerns, or their suggestions about CPD and what we're trying to do here. So, we appreciate that. I'll just leave it at that for right now. But so yeah, I had noticed in Dr. Shore's comments that right off the bat she listed that, and I thought we had done that, and then exactly it got rolled into the sponsored continuing education, and we didn't mean that to be part of sponsored continuing education, but to let people direct some of their own learning. But it does go under that activity, the ones, learning activities under academic, right?
Right. There's one point of clarification I would like to make to the extent that people are watching today, and that is we're working on a new regulation package. The old regulation package doesn't exist anymore. People are, and I think partly because of the confusion we've created by taking the old regulation package off the table, people are commenting on things that have already changed in the new regulation package. So I would just urge people, we certainly welcome your input and your comments. I would urge people to, if they want to make comments on text or comments on the structure of the continuing professional development regulations, they may want to wait. They may want to wait, and you may not want to wait, but you may want to wait until we actually have a more finalized regulatory package for you to look at, because many of the issues that people continue to address are actually issues that we hopefully have resolved in these in this new proposed regulatory package. So I just thought I'd let people know that so they weren't confused. I was at a social function with a lot of psychologists recently, and more than one of them came up to me and said, "When does this start?" And I had to explain to them that we haven't even gotten to the point where we have completed the initial pass on the new package, so we don't know when it's going to start because we don't know if it's even going to pass. But because people are concerned that they had to start changing their learning activities now. So just know where we are in the process. We kind of went back to go. We're a couple steps past, we're right back to the start, but we're a couple steps past that, but you don't want to confuse yourself by looking at the old regulatory package.
Thanks, yeah, I appreciate that. So, we, let's see, acceptable CPD learning activities under is that academic? I'm just trying to see. No, that's a separate one. So I'm trying to think what it was a separate one. We had decided on it as a separate one. But would it go under professional activities? Or would it go, because now the way this is worded, unless we change the wording, that heading is now called sponsored continuing education. And it's not, we're not talking about sponsored continuing education. We're talking about self-directed learning.
It still seems to me, though, that it's an acceptable learning activity.
Of course. All of these are.
Right.
Yeah.
So I don't know if that means we need to create another category of acceptable learning activities called self-study or self-directed study. That may be the way to do it, as opposed to having it anywhere near the continuing education material.
Okay. So if we did another one called self-directed study, and that could be reading a book, reading articles, watching videos of demonstrations of stuff, or
Listening to podcasts.
listening to podcasts, yeah, all kinds of stuff like that.
I think that'd be interesting, but I also just picking back up what you just said, Dr. Horn, should it be under professional?
Yeah.
Because I know that we have that for the group kinds of activities we just described.
Right.
Listed underneath professional activities, so I could go either way, but it might make sense to do a 8 or whatever, or a 2 and shift everything down and keep that closer on page 2. But either way, but I do think that it's a great catch, Dr. Phillips, because I know that was a conversation that we had, and I think the intention was to make that more of an opportunity for folks to get CPD.
And I think Dr. Shore was really the one that, so we're going to say it's a great catch by Dr. Shore.
Yes, yes.
That's right.
But yes, and great catch to see that that's where we collapsed it in
Right.
here. So both of you all, thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, so I think we want to think, where does it make sense for it to go? I don't know if it's a separate category or if it would be, because if we look at the learning activities under professional activities, you know, it's kind of a wide range of different things that a professional would do. On the other hand, if we look at these, all of them, except maybe conference attendance, but part of what we're doing for that is because of the kind of interaction. But all of these involve somebody else besides the person. So, I mean, it is more an independent activity. You know, it's not like a reading group, which would be like part of peer consultation or something like that. It's more of an independent activity. So what do you think? Should it be a category called independent learning activities? And maybe that would be any self-directed. What do y'all think? Think that sounds good?
That language makes sense to me, but just so I know where we're situating it, we're situating it under A, or we're situating it under B, acceptable CPD learning activities? Because it's not...
They're all acceptable CPD learning activities. So we have acceptable
right.
CPD learning activities under professional activities, we have under academic, we have under sponsored continuing education, and then we have under board certification. So
I would think it would be a separate category like an E. I don't know if that's where we want to put it in the lettering, but...
yeah, or maybe D, and then E would be the kind of the big one that gives all the, you know, where there's a possibility of learning.
I like that language you just proposed, the independent learning activities. Thank you, Mr. Glassbeagle. I think I like that, and
Okay.
that makes sense. And I do think that it would be the D, not E.
Yeah. Okay, so if we call it independent learning, is that, okay, independent learning activities, then we are talking essentially about self-directed learning. So acceptable CPD learning activities under, quote, independent learning activities, or we could say independent learning, end quote, include, and then we can say self-directed forms of learning that aren't, you know, that the, I don't know, that the licensee, well, self-directed implies that, including what, reading, studies, articles.
Online research.
Online research, meaning what?
Well, I think these all have to be related to
Yeah.
psychology, right?
Right,
So we want to make
right.
sure that they're activities, because we can all do independent learning activities related to other things. So I think, for instance, if I was to go to the APA database and do a search for journal articles and look at a variety of different abstracts for journal articles on a particular topic, to me that's a learning activity, and then I might select out a couple of those articles to actually read.
Just for the search itself is a learning activity? I would
Yes, for
disagree
me.
with that.
Well, it is for me in terms of being able to tell what the overall research is related to a particular topic.
But what's the but then you have an outcome for that. It's not the search itself, then it's.
Well, the outcome's usually choosing articles that
Right.
you, right.
So, I mean, I think that that's the piece, we want that follow through, you know, it's like, oh gosh, there are X number of articles on this, but I think really what we're interested in is that the person then does a search, but then says, I want to look at these articles because I'm doing this kind of work, or I want to know a little bit more about this or something like that, right?
Maybe we need to just say what, like reading journal articles.
Right. Books.
Reading all or a portion of a book. Watching videos related to psychology. Listening to webcasts related to the practice of psychology.
Right. So these won't be, I don't think this is going to be all inclusive, but yeah. But I do think we want to just give some examples of the kinds of things that people might do independently that would that would count. It's like you decide, licensee, you decide what you really want to know more about, read a little more about, listen a little more about, whatever.
I think to your point, Dr. Horn, about kind of the outcome, if we go to the language that we have on page 2 under peer consultation, kind of, and where we kind of make the connection to what the activities help, and kind of what you said, Dr. Phillips, about what they should focus on. I mean, I think that in addition to those examples that were just provided, I think some of that language could be lifted over to make that connection to what the outcome is. And I think also, as you were saying, it won't be an exhaustive list necessarily. And it's
Right.
like, and other activities such as, or
Right.
whatever the best
Yeah.
language is. But I think this kind of language, I think, helps get that, to answer that
Yeah,
question.
that's good, and even the way it says these activities
Yeah.
should be
It's a great
focused
catch.
on maintaining, developing, or increasing conceptual and applied competencies that are relevant to psychological practice, education, or science. That's great. I mean, that's really what, and that's typically why people will do that independent stuff. I hope somebody is helping us with the language. Oh, great.
Right before the note at the bottom.
Okay. Includes, self-directed.
This is just rough language.
Self-directed, that includes reading, it's reading, studies,
It's probably reading journal articles.
reading journal articles, leave studies out. Journal articles are studies.
We're going to take out online research.
Reading journal articles, books, watching videos, yeah.
Listening to webcasts, or watching a webcast, listening to podcasts.
Yeah. Or, say, or listening to podcasts. That includes, but is not limited to,
Yeah,
yeah.
including but not limited to.
Yeah, self-directed,
Learning activities,
Yeah.
including but not limited to.
it says self-directed learning that includes.
What beyond this list would you find an acceptable self-directed? If you say including but not limited to, that might not give staff direction on what other may include.
What, I don't know that we can come up with an exhaustive list, but I don't know, I mean, I know the things I do, I'm in that list.
Books, journal articles.
Yeah. Books, book chapters, articles, yeah.
I think now that we've got the language, maybe we should just let it settle a little
Yeah.
bit and see what activities also occur to us as we're looking at it. I get your point, though. I think it's difficult when we put
Yeah.
including but not limited to, and then people have to guess whether
Right.
it falls in the category or not.
Okay.
But we may be able to come up with some additional.
So maybe we should just say, include self-directed learning. Let's see, include,
Reading.
and then leave out self-directed learning that includes. Independent learning
Self-directed.
activities include reading journal articles, reading books or book chapters, right? Watching videos. Or webcasts. Yeah,
Oh, there you
videos
go.
or webcasts. Yeah. Or listening
Yeah,
to
thank you.
podcasts. Yeah, let's just leave it there.
And then just period and then go to
Yeah.
these.
For books, put reading journal articles or books. How about that? Yeah. Watching videos or webcasts or listening to podcasts. These activities should be focused on maintaining.
No,
Well,
sure,
sure.
I don't think that's a, well, I think,
Yeah.
comma at the reference.
You want a comment for it?
Yeah.
Yeah,
And not should be, but must be. Must be fixed.
Yeah,
So
must be.
should we change
yeah,
that
we
language
want
elsewhere
to,
too?
we want to take it, we said should be
It should be on yours too.
in peer consultation,
So I think we should change it to must be in both places.
Yes.
yeah, okay.
And I guess that my next question would be, and I guess hearing from the two of you, maybe you could help on that, in my mind, kind of what Ms. Sorick just mentioned about giving direction to staff. And so like we went through all these other categories at the last meeting, what would be the verification piece for this? And is it easier to do it in chunks of I just trying to think of like units of ways of looking
I think
for verification.
I read this article. that
Or I
could-
read this book and it took me 9 hours.
Yeah, but I think we, again, we need to put a limit on the number of hours of
Well,
independent
yeah.
learning, so. But yeah, I think it would be, this is what I read, this was what it was about, or.
And 1 hour equals 1 hour.
Yeah, 1 hour equals 1 hour with a maximum of. Yeah, I think it should match attending conferences. Because, I mean, I think it's a good thing to do. I think, we're kind of just, right now, we don't know how this is going to shake out. I know that people, typically the way I think most people read is to inform what they're doing, but it's not, they don't spend tons of time like doing that reading, so I don't know that it should take a whole lot of time, but I think if we give 6 hours, it would match that conference attendance, and then this is really about, we do want you to do stuff like this and encourage you to do stuff like
But
this.
I think if we make the numbers too high at that
Is that
point,
right?
it kind of keeps people out of the flow.
Yeah.
Self-study is not an
Exactly.
interactive or participatory
Right.
thing typically. So I think we want to give people the flexibility, but not so much flexibility that they avoid interaction with their peers.
Right.
Yeah.
And, just kind of as an aside, I remember this was years ago, I think, when we were first talking about this. Dr. Linda Crow and I gave a presentation at CPA on this model. And there were a couple of psychologists in the audience who were licensed psychologists but weren't practicing, but wanted to keep their licenses active because of things that they were doing, but you didn't need a license to do it, but it was helpful for them. And they just were kind of going through the stuff, and one of the things they said, if, kind of all the practice stuff, if you take it out, they would be shy still. If they took all the continuing education allowed and then went to a conference, they would still be shy of the total number of hours needed. And, or at the time, it was a conference and did independent learning activities, they'd still be shy. So I remember bringing that back to the board and us, or the board at that time, having that conversation. Let's increase the conference attendance and the independent learning activities so it equals, it would be enough to put those people, they could keep their license, they could go to continuing education, and then they'd have these other activities that would help them maintain their license, but they're not practicing, so. Dr. Linda, oh, I'm sorry, wait a minute.
So here's the process. Or do you want to do what you did yesterday and take public comment as you go? Or?
Yeah, I do want to take public comment as we go. I'm sorry I didn't comment on that, but yeah. Ms. Jones, and then we'll have you come up.
I'm just going back to the letter that was here, and you were thinking about other ideas. The only thing that I think is missing from what was offered by Dr. Short is the notion of listserv conversation discussions. And so I just wanted to just make sure, just as we are
Thank you.
reviewing the suggestion, and I think in terms of the reading piece, and think in terms of, the only thing that I think is not covered also is professional newsletters, but I think, I don't know if that, we want to actually specify that, but I just feel like in looking at the suggestion here, I just didn't want to lose an opportunity to discuss that.
Thank you, yeah.
I'm not advocating either way, it just was.
You
bringing
just
it up.
are saying what she mentioned, yeah, so.
And try to like just get our feel
Yeah.
and the pulse on that, those ideas.
As for listserv activities, I'm of two minds. I mean, I think people do get valuable information from looking at listservs, but unfortunately, and this is not the fault of listserv moderators, but there's a lot of misinformation on listservs. In fact, sometimes I feel like there's more misinformation than there is correct information. And I think Dr. Shore said, for instance, listserv conversations about ethics, but oftentimes it's not the ethicists that are involved in the conversation, and the actual answers given are incorrect. So I'm just not sure about the quality of the learning experience. I think it's valuable. I think it's a valuable way for people to interface with each other. It's an interesting way to be able to find referrals for particularly difficult patients to match. And sometimes there is great information in there, but sometimes there's not. So
I would tend to agree, I'm sorry. I think so many things people can learn from. I mean, that's great. And I think there are a lot of things, yes, you can learn from from listservs or even newsletters. But I think in terms of the kinds of things that we're wanting to give credit for, I really agree with you. I think there's often a lot of misinformation that on listservs, at least that I'm on, that don't necessarily get corrected, and so I think that's a case. And then I think also just reading newsletters, while that's a good thing, I mean, it keeps people abreast and stuff like that. I don't think it rises to the level of the kinds of things that we're talking about.
No, and I agree, and I guess I just am reminding myself of our conversation, I guess in January or February. I think it is a tough one as we expand, but then I know also we really cautioned ourselves it's hard to make a judgment on the value of, and I think because. So I kind of feel like I react to that comment. It's like, oh, that doesn't feel in sync with what other conversations we've had. I get it though, and I feel like it is a fine line to do the expansion and then figure out what rises to the level without us, because I think going back to Ms. Sorik's comment, I feel like in terms of the guidance for staff, and figuring out how we then determine what is appropriate can then be a tricky slope.
And I guess this reminds me of the conversation we had about publishing and where we were going to draw the line with publishing. I do think if you've got a journal article, I don't know if we want to say in a journal article, in a peer-reviewed journal, we might want to say that.
We might want to say that, yeah.
At least we're looking at things that are perhaps have a higher probability of being scientifically sound. I'm not saying they're scientifically sound all the time.
That's right.
But it's more of a quality assurance. And I really don't want to disparage listservs. I've used them quite a bit.
No, they're a great way to communicate, and we can often learn, so.
So, Mr. Glassbeagle, can we add that by journals?
Peer-reviewed journal
please?
articles, and that's a hyphenated, peer-reviewed.
Thank you.
Dr. Linda Crow, did you want to say something about this issue?
Thank you. Dr. Joe Linder-Crow, I'm the CEO of the California Psychological Association. I know it's early in the day to start asking really hard questions, but this is really an interesting conversation, and I know we have a lot to get through. I applaud the board for opening up this category. I do want to say that there are a lot of things that have to be balanced, I think, as California moves forward with this. And I want to be sure that you would leave the independent, self-directed, home study, whatever we want to call it, in the traditional continuing education category. I say that because many organizations in California, including CPA, are approved by the American Psychological Association to offer CE credits for psychologists. There is a way to offer CE credits for independent study under the APA approval. However, it is not just wide open. You must demonstrate, for example, that you have learning objectives, you have done something to decide how long it's going to take someone to read a magazine or a book. You have to have a test. So I'm sure that psychologists would very much appreciate thinking that if they read the CPA listserv, that they could get CE credit for that. I'm sure they would love that. But in most cases, I think, at least till now, even independent study has had some kind of structure around it, something to, it's not just kind of like wide open, because the way the conversation is going, and I'm not arguing against it, because it's sort of an interesting situation to be in. As you know, I have a long history in continuing professional development in my career. I also want to really represent what would be the best for psychologists, and particularly those members of CPA. The way the conversation is going, and I know that there'll be a limit on this, but it could be that a person could earn 9 credits or 6 credits just kind of by doing the things that you would expect people to do on an everyday basis. And listservs and things like that, they can be instructive, but Dr. Phillips and Dr. Horn make a good point. Sometimes they are not instructive, or they are instructive in a not helpful way because there is misinformation, and we have seen that over and over again. I would think the way that this could be very beneficial is, for example, if there was a webinar on a certain topic that wasn't offered for CE credit. And there are a lot of reasons why sometimes we would want to do an educative event and not necessarily offer CE credits for it. Just because we don't have time to go through the process of getting it all approved and that sort of thing. These can be very helpful. And so if someone could attend a webinar on a certain topic and then be able to describe that webinar, you would have a description, you would be able to say how long it lasted, you would be able to say what it was. So I think there's just this balance, and I know this is the dynamic tension with this in opening up categories, which we certainly support, but also to balance it with the knowledge that there are other structures in place, like those things that APA requires. So we would need, we'd want to have it in both places. So we would have it in, you can earn independent study. And then I think we've talked about before, if that were the case, then I suppose that a person would choose under which category they wanted to use it, right? They could, if they do the independent study of reading our magazine, and each issue of the magazine offers 3 credits because we have post-tests, we have learning objectives, we have 4 or 5 feature articles. they could count that under tradition.
Sponsored.
Yes, yes, or maybe they could count it in the other one if they didn't need it over here. And that's, I think, where we kind of get tripped up. I do want to just say, I would really urge us to consider some other term other than sponsored continuing education. Nobody is using that term.
What term is the term of art?
Traditional continuing education is what most people say. It's what I find rolling off of my tongue. I think sponsored continuing education is not a very descriptive term, and it's hard to understand what that is. And I don't know that the other term is better, but it is kind of what people end up saying, you know.
So let me just respond to you. I guess when I was thinking of the independent, I wasn't necessarily thinking about taking out the
Okay.
self-directed part from what we're now calling sponsored continuing education, because I know that there are those things that people can do, but they are, to use our term,
Yeah.
sponsored continuing
Right.
education. In other words, you know, people take a test, they, you know, da-da-da-da-da. So that's what we mean. You know, it's vetted in those ways by, when we're talking about sponsored. If traditional continuing education includes reading your magazine, getting CE credits for it, that would be all right with me, because in my thinking anyway, and I mean, I'm just speaking for myself, it's really the piece of the evaluation, you know, that distinguishes it from other kinds of learning
Right.
activities. So,
Yes, it has a structure around it, I
Yeah.
guess, is what may distinguish it from just saying, I read 3 journal articles on, you know, CBT.
Well, it results in the issuance of a formal CE certificate, correct?
Yes,
So I think of all those things as being part of formal, traditional.
formal might be another
Formal might be
word,
better.
education,
right.
Yeah.
You're right, that's a really important point, I think,
Yeah.
that those activities that are offered by an approved provider of continuing education, where you do end up getting a certificate that verifies your attendance, fall under that category. And
I
then we're
think-
talking about opening up all of these other things for earning CE hours as well.
I want to make the distinction between that, and I know some of the continuing education providers are thinking about setting up peer consultation groups through their organizations.
Yes, they are.
But those wouldn't result in continuing education certificates. That would be
peer consultation.
verified peer consultation, I suspect, correct?
I think that's, remains to be seen. But I think people are thinking forward about how to facilitate, I guess, something like a peer consultation group, either online or in person, so that people could earn those credits but it will be in an organized way. But other people do peer consultation or case study, for example. We know many people who have a regular case study group that they meet with once a month, and they have a certain format that they use. They don't get CE credit for that. They would be able to count it under the new model, but they wouldn't have a CE certificate
Right,
that
right.
says.
So I was just trying to make a
Right,
distinction.
no, I think that's a really important distinction.
think when
And maybe a way of,
Yeah, so those verifications of experience through like a formally organized peer consultation group should not look like, or not denominated formal continuing education, otherwise we've got ourselves all confused.
Right.
It's really not, it's a separate learning activity.
so just something to consider, but I think maybe that, if we can find ways to distinguish that core, that formal
Formal would be the-
continuing education that we all know and love, you know, that would be helpful, I think, to psychologists in being able to distinguish this thing from from this thing. Because this thing, you're going to always be able to send to the staff your CE certificates. And whatever the cap on that ends up being, that will be easily verifiable by the staff. These other things, you're going to be listing and documenting in some other way as a supplementary or complementary activities.
So let me jump in right now, because I think the difference I see, we wouldn't take it out of the C, because in this case, self-directed is a delivery method.
Correct.
And I actually feel like, before we say I think we put that on the table, formal versus sponsored. I think in this case, there's a sponsoring entity that then is awarding the CE credit. So I actually feel like, I think that was part of the discussion before with sponsored. I know it's a change, and I think that we do a great job of then describing the definition of what it is. And I think that distinction for this one in terms of independent learning is actually everything as opposed to just a delivery, right? It's actually
Exactly.
crafting it. And I do think that you bring to us an interesting thought, which goes back to like I was saying a second ago about the judging of it and how do we determine what is acceptable in a certain way, and that's not the word I'm looking for, but that's the word it's coming. But like figuring out how then we can then verify it. And I think that I agree with what we were saying before about the number of hours, capping that one a little lower perhaps, because it's different than someone just by delivery of self-directed in this. It sounds like there's still something already established that they're buying into in a sense, as opposed to them just developing their pathway and their kind of course of study in a sense. So I feel like it is the two that should be distinguished, and we should have them in both places perhaps. I think we do still are at a conundrum how you then figure out how do you define independent learning for verification's sake. And I know we said hour for hour, but then you're also debating how do you define the hour. Because when you have the self-directed study from a sponsored continuing ed or traditional continuing education program, I'm sure you all then have a cap on what those hours are. You define what they are as you submit paperwork to get approval for CE credits, right?
You have to demonstrate a method for determining how many CE credits you're going to offer for something. Like, if you have a book, or in our case, a series of articles, then you have to have a few people read those articles and say, on average, it took me, 2 hours overall to read these 4 or 5 feature articles in the magazine.
So in this
And then
case-
you kind of average it out, and you say, we think we can demonstrate that for each issue of our magazine, a person should be able to earn this many credits. Now,
So in
that's
this case, the sponsor determines that, and then in this
Yes.
case, we're telling the individual to
Yes.
determine what it is. And I think that's the distinction here
Yeah.
about delivery versus.
And
something
I'm
different.
thinking while you're talking that maybe the term organization-sponsored CE might be something else to consider. I think because sponsorship often has it makes me think of money, like sponsors for our convention. We have sponsors for our convention who give us money to sponsor things at our convention. So organizationally sponsored
Why don't we say sponsor approved continuing?
I think that would be maybe another way
I
to
think that's
to
actually-
do it.
That might have been
Mm-hmm.
a term we had.
I think maybe it is. So it's a small thing, but it's funny because I know that nobody knows what that means. And so I think sponsor approved, would be something to consider. Because that's more just, I guess the challenge is to be descriptive enough so that
Right.
someone looking at it can say, oh, I get that. That means like when CPA offers a course.
Right.
And by the way, Ms. Jones, I think the term independent study is the term, APA uses the term independent study to mean that the delivery method that you're going to use is going to be through independent study. Person's going to read a book, person's going to view a course, not live, and then take an exam on that. So independent study, and I do like the term self-directed learning
I was just thinking the same thing.
for this
self-directed.
other kind of thing,
Right.
because that is also very descriptive. It's, that is, I'm going to read the last 2 issues of this particular journal because it relates to the work I'm doing.
Right.
So that may be, again, a good way to distinguish. So we don't keep, I think what happens is we kind of end up using these terms interchangeably, and then they lose their meaning. But independent study has a certain meaning within the continuing education community. And then self-directed learning, I think, also does.
I also think, though, it's important, I think kind of what you said, the kind of opening comments, Dr. Phillips, about as we approach this, I think all this language is changing. I think we have a challenge, 2 challenges simultaneously. It's actually defining what the substance is, and then the language. Because I think that no matter what we do, CE to CPD means a lot of difference. So I think that we should also just acknowledge, we're gonna have to do a good job, whatever the terms that we get, but this
Right.
is helpful to hear like what are similar terms. But I do think that the semantics of it is one thing, but also the substance is a really important one. And Mr. Glasswegiel, I know you were at H, you were at an earlier version, because we have it both places. We have it under academic, sponsored CE, and then we also have it under sponsored continuing education. So I know you had on the screen a second ago, page, in this case, it would be page 9 at the bottom. And then also it's on page 10. So I think you make me think, Dr. Dolan-Crow, that we should probably figure out how we talk about it in both places,
Well, one of
perhaps.
them's instruction, that's teaching, that's under the academic one.
Right, but again, about sponsored approved or
Right,
sponsor, I'm just
right.
saying language, because I think that notion of the
Right.
language would still carry over both places.
Yeah,
right?
that's a very good point, because that is,
So
it is about
sponsor
instruction, but it's,
That's gonna be our wording, right? Sponsor hyphen approved, continuing education.
And I just looked at up there, I saw that screen, but I think it is important that
Right.
you do it both places.
right. And I,
We just need to make sure we're languaging these things exactly the same.
Exactly the same.
All the way through.
Definitions and the,
Yeah.
what it entails.
and I think we have to recognize that it's going to take a while. People are going to refer to the CE regs, I mean, because
Yeah.
and it will take a
That's fine.
while to change over to the new nomenclature, but I think that as long as it's consistent in the document, then we have something to point to. And if someone says, I don't understand, what do you mean? Then we can start saying sponsor-approved continuing education, as opposed to peer consultation or something under professional activities and so forth. Okay, thanks.
Sponsored? No, there's no.
But I do think it's an interesting place to be, because it's like the
Yeah.
two, twice, we're trying to describe
Right.
things, 2 different, in substance and in nomenclature.
Yes, we are, and that's a good point, Thanks for your comments there. So again, I think this is helpful as we flesh it out. So could we go to the self-directed learning activities, is that what we're calling?
And I like that term better than independent learning.
Yeah, I do too.
Yeah.
Independent study sounds like something formal. A formal program of independent study.
So
I'm gonna
it's
know about
self,
that procedure.
it's self-directed.
Self-directed
Instead of
learning.
independent.
Yeah.
Are you changing it in C as well? Taking out self-directed?
Formal continuing education, yeah, it's gonna be called sponsor-approved continuing education.
Are you taking out self-directed and just using independent study?
Self-directed learning,
I think Dr. Linda Crow was saying maybe we should put independent learning
Or
there.
independent study?
Or independent study, rather.
Yeah.
Yeah, independent.
Oh.
Take
Yeah,
out-
just take
You
out the
want
self.
self-directed independent study?
No, just
Just take the
independent
self-directed
study.
out,
Okay, just independent study.
We don't want to confuse our,
language.
Any
Any
more
more
than
than
we
we
are.
have.
We'll have to have a doctor.
Yeah.
Maybe you should say, or through independence, or via independence.
Actually, I would take out the home study example.
Yeah, take out the example.
Yeah, the home study example doesn't work there anymore.
Right.
Right. Okay, so course or presentation means an approved, means a sponsor approved systematic learning experience.
Yeah. Now, does the word, use the word provider in there confuse us?
Provider approved instead of sponsor approved?
Or change the word provider,
To sponsor.
except if,
Jeff, is it provider if you have direct back?
No, the provider is the one
Who
doing
got-
it.
who got
They're
a
not the one
sponsor.
approving it.
Yeah.
so they got, they're the ones that got approved
Right.
by a sponsor.
Right.
So maybe we should say,
Right there.
provider means a sponsor approved organization, institution, association, or other personality.
Provider means,
Is it provider in the? Where else is it used? Jeff, is it provider in the? Earlier in the document? You don't use the term sponsor, do you?
You mean in this document or?
Well, I mean, I think in California you use the term provider. APA uses the term sponsor. But I think we decided on provider.
In our current, like, I think we do refer to sponsor.
We do.
No, we-
so why are we even putting provider there? Provider is the organization, institution, person, or entity that is actually taking
Right.
responsibility for what's presented. That is a provider, and that is, it could be the sponsor, but
It's in the definitions.
where?
Page 1. So you use the term provider. Then you would want to use the term provider instead of sponsor.
But this is going away.
Yeah,
Okay,
page
this
1
is
is
the
going
old,
away.
this is the old statute,
So it'll,
or
it's effective until
Regs.
December 31st, 2018.
old regs.
I think it is.
Can I make a suggestion?
And really, we're talking about the sponsor. Whoever takes full responsibility is the sponsor.
For provider.
Yeah, I think we need to search and see if we use provider anywhere in the document.
19 matches.
Okay, so we do need provider.
Can we click on to see where that
Oh,
actually
Dr. Ennis,
shows
come on
up?
up. We're
Ones are 22.
allowing public,
Thank you. Marilyn Imos from CDCR. I don't know if this is going to help clarify things or confuse them. We're APA-sponsored, CDCR, and we deliver from headquarters a lot of our own continuing education. However, we have different institutions who have to submit presenter application materials to our committee for approval. And we do a lot of research on that, and then as a sponsor, we either confirm that and approve that, or we don't. In that case, would the deliverer of the coursework be the provider, deliverer of the coursework, because we're the sponsor? We take responsibility for what goes out there, but our committee looks at everything and makes a stamp of approval or rejection, or works with the people to help get it into a state where it can be approved.
I would actually want to make a distinction, because we're talking about sponsor-approved continuing education. I think we're talking about like APA or CPA approving a particular provider, correct?
Right.
So sponsor in that sense is it the
Ah.
national organization or the state organization?
Good
or
idea.
is it the-
right, right.
Yeah.
So we're APA approved.
Yeah, so
So
you're,
What do they call us, though?
Can I actually add something on page 5? we refer to as sponsors, where we list APA and several other
Mm-hmm.
entities that
APA is the sponsor.
Is the
That's-
sponsor.
APA is the sponsor?
Yeah.
That means that CDCR is the provider?
No, APA is
No,
not the sponsor.
I don't
But
think
that's
so.
the old.
There's-
That's the point.
I mean,
They're the
that will
ones who
be
Thank you.
approved it.
On page 5.
I think we're making this way more
are.
complicated than it
Good,
needs to
good.
be.
Please clarify.
So, APA is an approval body,
Right.
and they approve sponsors
Right.
of continuing education
okay.
for psychologists. So you are an APA-approved sponsor,
Sponsor,
that because
yes.
that's, but that's just because that's the word they use.
Yeah.
We're an APA-approved sponsor. CPA approves providers.
Providers.
We call them providers.
Oh,
But it doesn't really matter what the word is, as long as the meaning is the same. So I think what you're talking about is the provider being the organization that offers the continuing education.
that's what I
Right.
thought.
So even though you may have people who are doing it out there
Mhm.
under your umbrella, you have responsibility for the
Correct.
program. And that's part of APA's rules, that you have to take responsibility. So I think that the term provider is a good term, in my opinion. It does, sponsor, provider, we chose provider when we organized our Office of Professional Development and began to approve organizations. We chose the term provider because we felt it was clear that we are approving this organization as a provider of continuing education for psychologists. They meet our criteria. So it doesn't really matter that much. I guess I would argue for provider just because I think you've already got it in a lot of language.
Yeah, we're saying whoever is responsible for
Right.
the program.
Right, your definition on page 1 in the current regs is a good one, I think. Provider is the organization that is responsible for the content of the program.
Mhm. And that's what we've essentially repeated here on
Right.
page 2.
It's just consistency is important, that's
Yeah.
all.
So in that case, it would be the same as sponsor,
It means the
according
same.
to
Yeah.
APA's use of that word.
Yeah, it means the same.
Can I make a quick,
However, in our data, in our language we've changed before, we started using approving agents, organizations too.
can I just make a quick comment of how I explain the process to licensees or people asking, how do I become a CE approved provider?
Yeah.
And I tell them, you have to be you have to be approved by a board recognized agency. A board recognized agency would be APA, CPA, CMA, or ACCME. So I put those 4 agencies under board recognized, and then they're approved to be providers of CE. That's just the way that I explain it to them.
I think, Ms. Jones, that you're right, that is another term, but it's not perhaps relevant to this thing that you're talking about right now, because you want to convey that this kind of CPD under provider-approved continuing education is offered by an organization.
Well, actually, our language, Dr. Littercrow, says approving organizations shall ensure that approved providers. So I agree with you,
Yeah, yeah,
providers.
yeah.
I'm not saying it should go away.
Yeah.
But for this sentence, it seems like we also have a different definition about approving organization that goes different than what we approve from the current regs. And so if we go back to that line, it's also saying who has full responsibility. Would it be the approving organization as well as the approving provider or not? Because I feel like we've introduced another term that is different than what is in that first
Well,
section.
in our case, for example, as an APA-approved, so CPA is a good example. We can offer CE credits because we are APA-approved as a sponsor of continuing education, and we can do that. The organizations that we approve as providers in California, they are fully responsible for the programs. So we have the same model that APA has at the national level, we have at the state level. So I do think that the word provider, in our case, would be clear.
I'm not denying that, I'm just saying the way we've listed it here,
Yeah.
I think we've added a lot of definitions and terms that makes it confusing. So I think I get what the structure is, I feel like we've gone back and forth in this, because
Right.
I think, I don't know what we're trying to say here in that sentence. Is there's no provider mentioned in this
You mean in
section.
C?
There's
Well,
no-
I think if you switch the word sponsor for provider, you're just describing those activities that would be acceptable under the category of provider approved or sponsor approved. Right now, it says sponsor approved. And that would be any,
I understand that, I'm just saying, no, but
Yeah.
it doesn't refer to the language here in 11, that refers to that same activity being done by an approving organization.
but approving organizations don't offer the courses themselves.
On this page 11, it says some of that language, is all I'm saying. I get what you're saying in terms of the way it is, I'm
Yeah.
saying the language is not matching up. I
Right.
don't think we're in disagreement
Right.
on the process.
I-
I think our
yeah.
language is confusing.
It might, yes.
And it needs to match up with yours.
Yes.
But I don't know, here it says something different, is all I'm reading it, it's different.
Mr.
I'll have to
Glasssteagall,
go back and look at that.
Can we go back to the page that we're discussing? Sure. Thank you.
Yeah, I'm confused about all the, I'm not sure what I'm looking at.
So I'm not sure what you're saying, Ms. Jones. I'm reading it, it says, sponsored CE courses must have been approved by a private nonprofit organization that has demonstrated to the board in writing that it blah, blah, blah. This is on page 11.
So, when you go down to that next section,
Number 2,
no, below that, where it describes what an approving organization is.
the approving organization shall ensure that approved providers.
So what Ms. Zwerk was telling me, if you look at page 5, this is kind of confusing because we have old language mixed in with new language.
Yeah.
So at page 5, where we use sponsors, like that language is been replaced by the language on page 11, which is approving agent organizations.
Right. Okay, so
So you
page
see what I'm
5
saying?
is going to go away.
Exactly,
Right.
so it goes to page 11.
Right. So if we go back to page 4,
Yes.
acceptable CPD learning activities under sponsor-approved continuing education, is that where we had provider? Well, that's not the first time we had provider, but,
And they were saying the provider refers to page 1, which goes away. So it's kind of, I don't get where it's coming from.
well, here we have,
And it really isn't a question about the actual activity, what
But-
happens. I'm just saying, when
Right.
I'm following the language.
I think
in
you're,
here,
but
it's
you pointed out earlier, and I think you're exactly right. You need to decide
maybe we
probably
want to
what
say
term you want to
organization
use.
approved.
Do you want to use sponsor, or do you want to use provider? Which really doesn't have anything to do with the approving agencies. That's a different thing, like who's approved by the board to approve providers or sponsors, whatever they're called. But you decide if you want to use the word provider to mean that an organization that offers CE courses in the more formal way, or do you want to use the word sponsor and then go back and,
I'd like to make a suggestion, we go back to calling it formal continuing education as opposed to sponsor-approved. We're introducing too many different, because okay, sponsor-approved, is it the provider that's sponsor-approved, or is it the actual course that's
Right,
approved by the provider? Because then it should be
it's not the
provider-approved.
course, well, it's, and we've moved away from course approval. That you did a long time ago, so it should never in any of this say the course.
Right, it's an approving agency or entity.
Is approve them as a provider.
As a
Provider's
provider of
responsible for the
contin-
content
that's
of
right.
the CE.
Can I ask Ms. Noonan, what would be most clear to you getting from a licensee, the documentation for this category? What term would be most clear for you or understandable, or what do you hear mostly from licensees?
And are you referring to The actual
The
organization that's providing the CE
Right.
would be a provider, a CE provider, that's approved by a board-recognized agency. Because we recognize APA and CPA, CMA and ACCME as approving bodies. And so I just refer to them as board-recognized agencies and leave it at that.
So, the proof for staff is anybody who engages in whatever kind of activity that we're gonna call this gets a certificate that they've completed that CE. And on the certificate, it says, you know, how many hours and who, and they're an approved sponsor by APA or blah, 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 blah. So all that information is there for them.
And do you see
We-
provider?
Mhm.
Do you see the word provider typically on the certificates?
Well, because they get a lot from the organizations approved by CPA, and we use the word provider.
Yeah.
So,
Yeah, and I don't think that's gonna be confusing for them. I think
No.
for us, we wanna be clear for people reading it.
But right then, Ms. Noonan said two different terms, recognized agencies, approving bodies. We're not using the same language, and I think, no, I'm not saying,
Right.
I'm just saying that it's fine, but I'm just saying, again, the nomenclature.
but it's
So-
two different things. That's what she's pointing, it's two different concepts.
No, well,
So
thing
first,
about-
the approving agencies are the ones you have named in your regs that you say have the authority, or you say, if anybody has any CE courses from any of these, you know, anything that these four organizations have
Dr.
approved.
Crowe, I get that topic. What I'm saying is
Right.
that she used recognized agencies by the board. I've never heard
Right.
that term anywhere here. And if we're saying that's a recognized agency of the board, it's a nomenclature issue.
Yeah,
I get this,
you're
I
right.
get the,
You're right.
I get the idea. It really, to me, is I'm saying we're using different language. And I think also here, even the section that's related to 1397.6 F1 is about peer consultation, correct? So I think that, I feel like I'm a little lost, and I don't mean to say that I get understanding the topic, I get that. It really is me making sense of the documents. Whatever term we use is fantastic, but I think we just have to be consistent, is all I'm saying.
What is the term that's in the regs if it's not,
Approving, isn't it
approved?
approving organization?
What is the term?
I'm responding to what Ms. Noonan responded to, recognized agencies by the board. I don't know what that.
Those are those organizations that we say you can be. We give you the right to vet providers, yeah.
But we call them approving organizations in here, or do we call them sponsors previously?
No, they're not sponsors, though, they're not sponsors.
Sponsors
Okay,
offer the course.
whatever y'all call them, that's one thing. I think we have to just think of what we want to say and get something that's really clear, and it'll be clear to our licensees and anybody who's reading it.
What-
So in our mind.
Yeah, go ahead.
So in our minds, we're approving entities, and those entities are going to vet groups or individuals or whatever to provide continuing education. And the people or entities or groups or whatever who provide it, now in my mind, they're the providers. The ones who actually provide the CE are the providers. The people who approve them to provide, or the groups that approve them to provide, well, there may be 3 layers there. There may be 2 layers, there may be 3 layers.
So what do we call them? Because currently in the regs here, we are calling them sponsors, correct, on page 5 as
Yeah,
it stands?
right.
So they may not be called that by other people, but
Right.
currently, we call them that.
Yeah.
In page 5.
Of the 5 of,
Right.
It says, continuing education courses shall be provided by APA or approved sponsors. It lists CPA or its approved sponsors.
right,
So sponsors is in the language, so that's, I'm just saying, I'm confused by
Right.
the language. And when I hear recognized agencies, it just feels like if we're looking at it all together, we're calling things different things that may be the same,
Right.
may not be the same.
I think I understand what the language means because I understand what the terms mean. I think because practically speaking, so the Board of Psychology has agreed to accept CE credits from APA, and APA offers their own CE programs and issues CE certificates. And it says APA or any of APA's approved sponsors. That's because that's the term APA uses. So both of us are approved sponsors from APA. So if somebody goes to the APA convention and they get credit, they get certificates from APA, they can use those. If they take something that we offer or that you offer, they get a CE certificate. And because we're an APA-approved sponsor, you've said that you will accept that. You also said that you would accept anything offered by CPA because we usually offer our CE credits under our APA provider, sponsor approval, but we actually don't have to. If I wanted to do something that I didn't want to, that I didn't think APA was going to approve, we could offer it. And so you have said if we issue CE certificates just from us, you will accept that. Or if someone takes something from one of our approved providers, that's the term we use, you will accept that.
Fantastic, and
So-
here it says, or your sponsors. That's where I'm having the confusion.
I know, and I have recognized that as an inconsistency, and either the language should be changed in these regs, or we should change our language, because we should not call them something that's not recognized in the regulations, and I've
So while it
already
appears-
spoken to my staff about that.
Well, it appears that we're in a disagreement.
No, we're not. No, I don't think we are.
really
I don't think
am
we
just
are.
confused about language.
I agree with you,
And want to make sure that it makes sense across the board, because
absolutely.
if we're using that language, and I think, again, as we're trying to change something, propose a change, that's going to be a shift in paradigm. We also then want to make sure that we all are then calling it the same. So if you're having that call with people, and they call the office, Ms. Noonan, and we say recognized agencies, we should just be in alignment, is all I'm saying. But I'm in agreement, and I get the concept of continuing education
Right,
and what
but
that means.
like, we could change our word from provider to sponsor, but we can't change what APA is calling their sponsors. We can't change that in California. So you are going to have the word sponsor.
Terminology for us.
For us.
For
that's
you,
all-
yes,
that's all we
absolutely,
care about.
just for this.
That's right.
That's right, because you can't change what they're going to use, the word they're going to use. We can change ours.
Yeah, and we're not interested in changing
Right.
their wording, but we
Right.
want our wording to match
But,
everything.
but I think
So-
the point is that what you're saying in this section, just to go back to that, is that whatever you end up calling this, sponsor-approved continuing education, formal continuing education, whatever, what you are saying is that that is within the whole continuing professional development spectrum, that you're trying to describe those more formal activities
Right.
that will be in this one category.
Right.
And I think that's all we're all interested in, is just being consistent so that you don't look in one, as Ms. Jones said, you don't look in one part of the regulation and there's one word, and then 5 pages later, there's another word. And, what I've learned is that in a meeting like this, we can all agree that that means the same thing,
That won't happen.
but that won't work when you're trying to read regulatory language.
So
Because
let's
it
say
says
we
what it
did-
says, right?
I'm
So-
sorry.
No.
I don't
that's
mean to
it.
interrupt, but
No, no.
I think we all get the problem here. So I think if we went back to saying formal continuing education, then we can say, as we're talking about how we approve different organizations to provide formal, or to approve courses or informal continuing education. We can call it formal continuing education as we're talking about our sponsor approval system and all that kind of stuff, all that kind of stuff.
So there'd be, I'm getting the language confused, there's authorized authorized, what was the language? Authorized approving agencies,
Yeah.
whatever they are, and then there would be providers. And that's, we're gonna use that language consistently throughout, because I think having the sponsor-approved thing is likely to get rejected at
Right.
the third term.
Right.
So I like the formal continuing education.
And then we can keep calling it formal continuing education all the way through, even when we're, when we're talking about a process.
Well, and I feel like almost like we should put some things in the parking lot almost, because I don't want us to make a knee-jerk reaction, because I think we also heard that people call it traditional
Yeah.
continuing education. So formal, traditional, sponsor approved, maybe, I think again, looking at substance and then figuring out what the universal word change will be is important, because I do think I think we've gotten a good handle on the difference between the independent study versus the self-directed learning. I just feel like I don't want us to just knee-jerk it, because I think it does make sense to say formal, but it sounds like also folks are more comfortable with traditional.
And can I make a quick comment about that as well? That traditional, I have seen a lot of, when we did have the previous reg package, a lot of people refer to it as traditional. And just to me, I think that formal CE implies that there's informal CE, and there's no such thing as informal CE. Or it might suggest that CPD is informal versus the formal CE.
Wouldn't that be true for traditional too? There'd be untraditional continuing education? Maybe
Well, traditional to me just means that it's the original form of what people have been using. I didn't get that
Well, I'm
at
just
first,
saying-
but that's a good point.
I'm thinking this is a living document. 30 years from now, people are going to look at it and go, why are they calling it traditional continuing education? Whereas, well, that's just my thought.
I think a traditional is a classroom,
Mm-hmm.
and this isn't necessarily sitting in a classroom listening to a lecturer. To my mind, that's traditional continuing education.
I mean, I think it's
I
a
mean,
hard one, because I think
yeah.
then, because I think that's a good point about formal. So
Yeah.
formal, is that a judgment call versus better than something that's not as formal?
No,
I
but
mean,
formal means it's structured in a certain way, and they're gonna get, it's been vetted by an organization that we've approved to vet continuing education, so there's a formality about it,
or there's an authority approved
An
process. So
authority, yeah.
that's why I go back to sponsor is a little tricky, dicey
Yeah,
word we
right.
saw. But I
yeah.
do think that sponsor approved, then it would lead me to say that would be the better term, right?
But what's a sponsor then?
Yeah, that's what, I think what confuses me is sponsor approved means that there is a sponsor, which I always thought was like APA or CPA, that approves it, but I think what Dr. Linda Crowe is saying is no, 'cause
There's
they're
an
just
approving
they're just the
agency,
approving agency, they're
organization.
not the
And
sponsor.
then there's the sponsor who may offer, get providers to offer a lot of stuff.
So, which is why we probably got to approving organization. Again, we do have the terms defined in here, and so while I get that, what was just described about the sponsor, and I understand that structure, the way we defined it in the regs before, it made sense in terms of it was those 4 entities or people that basically have been delegated authority through them, right?
Right.
To do it.
Right.
But if the sponsor is confusing, then it's an approval process at some level, as opposed to formal. Because I think in terms of how it's defined, we put structure in there. I mean, I think what we heard in terms of even it being approved, people have been determined the number of hours, it's very specific, I mean, all that. I don't know, I respond to that comment about formal versus informal, which is a good one to hear. But I do think in terms of approval, agency seems to be a part of that term.
So how about approved
Continuing education?
continuing education?
I think we should
And
use,
then-
I think we should just pick a word as a placeholder. I don't
Yeah,
get
we could
mired
spend
on this
forever
word.
on
We could
this.
spend the whole day on this.
Let's just say approved continuing education for right now, or approved
And put a
formal
note on it.
continuing
Is this the
education.
right word?
And this is like, we may ask people to come up with stuff. I don't wanna hold up this process because.
That's
we can't
exactly what I
think of
offered
the
in the
word.
beginning, put it in the parking lot. And I think that we should talk about the substance. I'm in agreement.
Right, okay,
We're all in the same place.
okay, so there we are. I didn't know what put in parking lot meant, but I do now.
Right now, I have to go to a place where you guys can't go. So could we take a break?
We can, I was just about to say the same thing, only the other way around, so let's take about a 10-minute break.
Dr. Horn, so we're going to
I think at this point, I don't know that we want to spend any more time on this part. I think what we're going to have to do is go back and make sure whatever term we use, our definitions match, and that but I think we are still on acceptable documentation for the independent learning or self-directed learning. Are we?
What page?
This is, huh?
That would be under page 9 or 10.
Well, we don't have it yet.
That's what we're putting all the
Hours.
vacation and hours.
Yeah, oh, okay. So, but the way we took them before is that we went through the whole thing and decided on all the stuff so we would be consistent and we wouldn't be going back and forth. So we've defined what it is and what it entails, what it must focus on. And now we want to say what will be the, one full hour of, engaged in the self-directed learning equals 1 credit, 1 hour credited, and
Verification, we think would be telling us what was read
or watched.
or watched, or whatever it was, the title of whatever it is that they read or watched. And I think that's it.
Yeah, topic
And they
and
certify,
date.
and they self-certify.
Yeah, maybe the date or dates.
Dates, yeah.
Yeah.
dates.
I think we did for peer consultation, that section, I think was good, dates, type of activity, and total number of hours.
Yeah,
We said that activity, I think we said what was
Yeah.
studied, or
Yeah.
what was read, or watched, or.
yeah.
So
Yeah,
will
but-
this be number 5 on page 10?
I think it'll be the new I.
Yeah.
Oh.
Yeah.
Yeah, and then,
Yeah, ABAP would go
I
down
will
to J.
be J. Yeah.
But I do think, and this is part of the confusion that I got looking at the form last night.
Right.
There was a lot of asking for
We're not-
rationales, and we're not gonna do that on most activities, so.
Right, we're not,
So
don't
just
even
ignore
talk
the
about
form.
those
Ignore the
forms.
form.
Yeah, don't talk about them anymore. They're out. Dates, number of hours, the topic or title. What was.
And the type, I think to see if it was listening
Yeah,
or watching.
and the type,
Yeah.
yeah,
You get first
type of activity, type of self-directed learning. Was it reading a book, was it a journal article, whatever?
That's
1
what-
hour
Equals
Full
whatever.
hour.
equals 1 hour, and then a maximum of 6 hours. That's what we're suggesting.
I have a quick question just about the amount of time that we're accepting, so a minimum of 1 hour. Does that mean that we're not going to accept anything less than an hour? Or is that going to be a blanket statement? Because I know currently the way regulations are is we don't accept anything less than an hour. And I know, Antoinette, you and I have talked about that, and we don't personally agree with that. So I'm not sure if we're going to have that still carry over to this regulation package.
I think it's fine if they spend 30 minutes to say 30 minutes. I mean, they still have to get all together 36
Mhm.
hours, so I'm okay with that.
But I think we should make it, for purposes of clarity, I think we should make it clear that it needs to be done in quarters of an hour, because otherwise we're gonna have 0.1 hour here and
Yeah.
0.7 hours there, and
True.
it's gonna become a nightmare.
But no
for you.
partial credit. So when you add up to an hour, then you get your hour credit, say, if you.
So it has to be a minimum of 1 hour and a
Yeah,
maximum.
A maximum of 6 hours.
Could you tell me what page you're on?
We're it'll be
Page 10.
page 10, at the bottom, I.
So just for a point of clarification, you're saying that if they read an article, if they read 5 different articles for Yes, it has to add up to 1 hour with those 5 articles. It can't be anything less than an hour. So they couldn't say, well, I read 1 article in 30 minutes. Like, can I count that? We wouldn't be able to accept that.
Yeah, they'd have to
Right.
have.
Have to
they'd
at least
a
meet
minimum
an
of
hour.
1 hour in order to count any of the.
To
any of
count
the
any
time.
of it.
Okay, so technically, we still aren't accepting anything less than an hour, right? Okay.
Right.
But they may keep track of it, you know, in that way.
I've just seen traditional, formal, sponsored, approved CE. Some courses are less than an hour, and we haven't been able to accept them.
Oh, no, I think we ought to accept those.
But you know what?
Absolutely.
It's it's not allowed
It's not? Okay.
Correct.
Then-
currently.
Okay.
So I just want to make sure if that's still how we're gonna.
And whatever's formal and traditional or sponsor approved or whatever it is, I mean, however many hours they give you, if they're not allowed to give more, but I, you know.
We're not allowed to give less.
Less than an
Less than
hour,
an
yeah,
hour.
so.
I know you're not allowed to give less than 1
minimum
hour,
is
but
1
sometimes
hour.
you can give like 3.5
Yeah,
hours or
we
something
do
like that.
that.
And I think we ought to count that 3.5, but nothing less than an hour.
Right, so if I get a certificate saying 0.5 hours, we're not gonna accept it.
Yes, we are. Oh, no, if
Right.
it's only 0.5, no.
Yes, correct,
No.
okay, okay,
Sorry,
thank you.
The minimum of 1 hour.
And
everything is a minimum of 1
Mhm.
hour.
Okay.
But we haven't put that in every single section here. We've only done it on a couple of them. We did it for peer consultation, and we've done it for supervision, and now we would be adding it here. The others we have not, so
We
if
don't
we
need
want to, if we don't need to, we don't need to, but if we want to, for consistency, include that. We probably don't do it for any kind of formal, traditional, whatever the term is, because if they can't do it already, it would never come in that form. But we also have for professional service, we have a minimum of 4.5 in one of our categories.
Right.
So we do have some minimums, but not on everyone.
Uh-huh.
So should we make a note to make sure that we look at each of the categories for minimums and maximums?
Well, everyone has a maximum, so.
Right, that's true, that's true.
I think we probably need to do that. But no, some of them are like 1 client or 1 patient equals 1 hour credit. That's for the, I'm looking at practice
So you're never
outcome
gonna have less,
monitoring,
you're never
so-
gonna have less than an hour in
Yeah.
that situation.
Yeah, and maybe that should be a statement, like up at the top, and then each one, you know, will have its own thing, but maybe up at the top, that you know, everything, the least counted for any activity is 1 hour, or, you know.
That'd be the other one, the easy way to do it, I think.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
Although, unless otherwise provided, because there's the categories we can only get either 4.5 or 1.
Right.
So we don't want to make it sound like they can, somehow they can get an hour for that.
Well, but we've said that. I think what we want to say is,
Well,
that's the least amount for overall.
I think if we're going to say that at the top, as to all categories, the least amount you can get is, the least amount of activity is going to be 1 hour. I think we need to say unless provided otherwise below.
Okay, or we don't need to put it on everyone, because we have, for everyone, we say what 1 hour equals. You know, everyone we say how we're gonna count this. So some of them, though, we do say in minimums, and others we,
And so I guess, and looking at that, maybe we just need to put a minimum for this one, this particular category, for
yeah,
self-directed. And the other ones, it is implied or it's actually specified a
Right.
minimum.
Okay.
okay.
And I know that Ms. Noonan said she didn't agree with, that staff didn't seem like you didn't agree with that. Action.
It's just because if the course is approved, it's approved for traditional learning or CE, so why wouldn't we accept it?
It's
Maximum
not,
of 6
it wouldn't
hours.
be approved by us or APA for anything less than an hour. It's not allowed.
I've seen a couple.
Well,
I'm not sure.
It's not allowed.
It's not allowed.
So that's not appropriate. That's clearly stated in both APA criteria and ours.
So if somebody's doing something wrong,
Yeah, I've seen a few certificates that say this course has been approved by APA, so.
Yeah.
I have
That
some-
It could be 1.5.
Yeah, no, 1.5, that's, I'll accept it, but I've seen 0.5 before.
We won't count that. Sorry. Sorry for those folks.
Mm-hmm.
There were a couple things I wanted to ask about. At the bottom of page 7, where it says, with the exception of the 100% ABAP board certification license, each shall accrue hours during each renewal period from at least 2 of the following 4 CPD activity categories. Do we now have 5?
Yeah, we now have 5, so we have to go through and talk about the
So that,
5 categories.
That leads to my second question. Now, I've been out of the conversation about CPD for a little while, but when I was involved in it, there was a discussion around wanting to have at least 2 categories because at least one of them would be encouraging peer consultation and discussion, which I think the committee at that point felt like the traditional CE wasn't providing as much as they wanted to. So my question is, if 2 of those categories are now either the approved CE or the traditional CE, whatever you want to call it, and then the second one is the self-directed, have you accomplished what you want?
Only one of them is approved or traditional CE.
So if one of the categories that they choose is the approved or the traditional CE, and the other category is the self-directed, and those are the 2 categories that the licensee chooses, have you accomplished what you want?
Yes, but they still need 3 more hours. Because we have a maximum of 27 and a maximum of 6.
Okay.
And that equals 33.
Okay,
But yes, that would achieve it, yeah.
Okay, I wanted to be sure about that. Then the only other thing I would say is, I think somewhere it needs to be explained, and I haven't seen it yet, so it may be in here, when you say a minimum number of, what the minimum is an hour, et cetera, to be clear that if you use that, you can't use it for less than the minimum, because otherwise it looks like every single one of these I have to take, where it says a minimum, I have to take that minimum. And I just want to know.
Okay, that's a great point, yeah. It's only if,
To get hours
Yeah.
underneath that
yeah,
section.
to get
we'll have
hours
to-
in that section, yeah. Ms. Sork, you had something?
Just something really quick to address Ms. Noonan's issue. Perhaps looking at page 7, B, after topics and subject matter for all CPD activities shall be pertinent to the practice of psychology. It may also be something for the committee to consider adding a sentence, a minimum of 1 hour spent in each activity is required for compliance with this section.
It's not necessarily 1 hour, because some things are by activity. So, but that might be a place we can say it. It has to be pertinent to psychology, and if
To claim credit in that particular
To claim credit,
category.
you need 1, credit can't be given for less than 1 hour credit, or however we have defined it.
Yeah, I think the hour credit is still applicable,
Yeah.
because we still then take whatever the activity is and we translate it into
Yeah.
hours.
Yeah.
So I actually, the Sork's comments would be appropriate, because I think even though it's not exactly an hour for hour
But it's
in all
not
of them.
hours spent, it is.
Hour credited.
Yeah,
Right.
hour credit.
So maybe a minimum 1 hour credit for each activity
Yeah,
is required for compliance with this section?
yeah.
Well, no, that
But
to
it's
me
not
is-
for each activity. It's
that makes
for
it sound like you have to do an hour in
It
each
does, yeah. But
category.
it's 1 hour credit for any
Activity for which you claim.
For which, yeah. The licensee uses or claims or. Another way to say that.
Correct.
Minimum 1 hour credit for any activity.
For which you claim credit.
Any activity for which, you can't say you, for which the licensee claims credit If we just say, any activity for which the licensee wishes to receive credit must, the license,
Must be 1 hour or more credit. No, that's
No,
not, that's really
uh-uh.
bulk, that's really.
yeah.
Can you repeat your sentence, Ms. Sorg?
Huh?
Can you just repeat what you said initially? Ms. Sorg?
That's not-
I just want to hear it one more time.
A minimum of 1 hour spent in each activity is required for compliance with this section.
And maybe I'm wrong.
It's not each
Can be
activity.
credited. A minimum of 1 hour spent in each activities can be credited to be in compliance with this section.
It's not an hour spent, it's an hour credited, because it's not an hour spent.
In order to claim credit for an activity, the licensee must spend a minimum of 1 hour. No,
It's not the time they're spending in some.
1 hour, it must have 1 hour credit.
In order to receive credit for any activity, the licensee
Or does the next section, E, like I'm just talking about accruing hours, is if it's sufficient, and then we describe each one, maybe we don't need to.
where are you?
Right
Okay.
below that D, that we were just, when we say the comment that Ms. March was saying about the two categories, we say you shall accrue hours,
What page?
page 7, right below that section.
E.
Do we need
Oh,
to have
in E,
it?
okay.
Do you need to put that, because then we talk about how you accrue the hours, and then we define them? I don't know if.
Yeah, you're right.
You're right.
From at least 2 of the 4, yeah. Let's not put it in D. We say that you have to do for at least of the 4,
And then we define them.
and, but now we'll say 2 of the 5, and a licensee shall receive no more credit than the maximum number of hours. So we could say no less credit than 1 hour, and no more credit than the maximum number of hours allowed
Oh,
per.
it's like that.
Where's that?
Good job, Jackie.
Yeah.
Top of page
Ms. Jones there for
A licensee shall.
One of the things that I had noted there, based on what we were just talking about, is where a minimum number is, here's some suggested language, where a minimum number of hours is specified, that applies where the licensee claims credit for that activity. So it's clear that you don't have to get that minimum for each, where it says a minimum, I have to run out and get a minimum in each of the activities. It's
Right.
only where you claim credit for, is that right?
Right.
Some suggested language.
Say that again?
Where a minimum number of hours is specified, that applies only where
Only
the
if the-
licensee claims credit for that
Yeah,
activity.
wishes to claim credit for that.
So where's that going?
I think that's,
I think the other one is more simple.
Okay.
I had it at the top of page, although Antoinette is saying that there's something else that's simpler, so, but I had it at the top of page 8, at the end of the paragraph of D, or, yeah, I mean E, I'm sorry,
At the end of E.
at the end of E.
Well, that's where we put this, right? Already. A licensee shall receive no more credit than the maximum number of hours allowed per renewal period. Oh, but wait a minute, where's the minimum?
We haven't added it
Oh,
Yeah, that's the language that.
yet. That's what we're
Those-
trying to.
those are the language we wanted to treat.
So it should be a license,
That's
a
what-
licensee shall receive no less credit than 1 hour and no more credit than the maximum number of hours allowed per renewal period.
Ms. Sarah for the same.
But again, I don't know that that reaches the idea of where there's a
How about
minimum,
this, for any,
you're not required.
how about this, for any activity,
For which credit is claimed?
yeah. A licensee shall receive no more credit, or no less credit than 1 hour and no more credit than the maximum number of hours. So for any activity the licensee wishes to use, claim for credit.
Or then maybe we just go back to putting a minimum on each one of them. you know what I'm saying? Because it's a minimum of 1 hour, even if it is, like one patient, we decide what 1 hour is credited, we define it in.
Okay, so if we say 1 hour of activity and peer consultation equals 1 hour of credit, parentheses, minimum 1 hour.
We do it in A, actually.
Oh, we do
1A.
it. We already
So we do
do.
it on some of them, like we have a
A
minimum of
maximum.
1 hour and a maximum. If we added that to the ones that don't have the minimum, and we added the minimum of 1 hour, would that make it just cleaner and more straightforward?
But like for practice outcome monitoring, one patient or client equals.
But they
1
still get an hour of credit, so they're still calculated in hours. So
I know.
if we say a
But
minimum
it's
of,
already a minimum, because each one you use,
So if you're gonna claim
can
any
you
credit,
get,
you'd have to have
if
one
you
hour.
claim any credit, it's gonna be an hour.
I actually like Ms. Jones' idea because I think to the reader, we gotta figure out what the reader of the reg is
Yeah.
gonna see. I don't think they wanna go fishing off somewhere in some paragraph over there.
Find it there.
About a
yeah.
minimum of 1 hour.
Okay.
I think we wanna do it in each category.
this is where uniformity,
Yeah.
I get what you're saying, because
Yeah.
everything gets,
You're
the
right.
hours get calculated differently.
So, okay, so just put, so when we say a maximum 9 hours can be used.
But that gets tricky.
Parentheses,
It's a minimum.
But it does get tricky when you get to academic coursework, for instance, right? Because we
Right.
basically are saying the minimum would be either 4.5 or 6, right? If it is a semester or a quarter. So it doesn't,
depending on what it is.
yeah, so, I mean, then do you say the minimum would be the smaller number, 4.5? Because they're not all equal.
But if
I
they
get what you're
didn't go
saying.
to it depends on whether they're quarter or semester, right?
Well,
But
Ms.
But still, you have the smaller of the two numbers, just,
Ms. Noonan, aren't you gonna have people call and ask, I took a 3-week course during the summer, it wasn't a quarter and it wasn't a semester.
Yeah,
How
it
do I
was.
count it?
That would be considered a
3
quarter.
week?
Yeah, absolutely, it'd be considered, I mean, depending on the institution, whatever your summer session is, that's it's considered a quarter.
But not every course is equivalent in summer
Or-
session, and not of them, I've taken weekend courses that were 16 hours, and they weren't, I think we got 1 unit for it. But it would all happen in 1 weekend. So are you gonna run into problems with people asking for courses that maybe didn't contain as many hours as you would in a semester or a quarter?
I would assume so, yes.
Okay, so what, are you suggesting something here?
I think that it could be a minimum of either a quarter in length or a semester in length. If it's a summer course, I get what you're saying, but there are other courses that get offered for very short periods of time over intersessions between
Right.
fall and
Right.
winter.
I mean, I think really this causes the problem, because it's like just in terms of the minimums. 'Cause I
Right.
think Ms. Marks and Ms. Stork's language was good.
Yeah.
It just doesn't match up to all the different kinds of
Right.
categories, because it's not the hours. But we didn't even think about that before in terms of intercession classes, you know? But in terms of what Ms. Noonan will receive, it will then make it harder for her to determine the number of hours.
Unless we say the minimum you can claim credit for is a quarter long or a semester long course.
Yeah,
Exactly.
And then if you take another course,
that's good.
good
That's
for you,
right.
but
Yeah,
it's not gonna get you credit.
I think we have to do that.
But then it
We
means that
have
we
to.
gotta go through each one and then do a minimum.
Yeah.
What if you
So
just do
what-
unless otherwise specified? And then
Unless
it's-
otherwise specified.
And then it's a
for
catch-all.
any- Yeah, unless otherwise specified,
Oh.
for any activity for which credit is claimed. A licensee shall receive no less than 1 hour credit, no more credit than the maximum number of hours allowed per renewal period.
I don't think that stops us from having to go back and look at each of these categories to determine if there's a maximum and minimum needs to be stated.
Okay, let's do it then. I mean, I think that's the time to
Yeah,
do
might as
it.
well, should we
Yeah.
just push through that?
Have you gone backwards? Are you on page 8?
I'm on page 8, but the book might be 7.
No, it's page 8.
It's
the end of it.
That's what we said.
We would go back.
Backwards, but.
Backwards.
Yeah.
look at the
I
categories.
mean, we
over
could
there.
go quickly, I think. That's kind of what I'm saying. They're the people
Well, I would like, a licensee to be able to sit down and read this thing and understand what the hell they're doing. So I, yeah.
I mean, but I also want to assume if we, there's some balance there.
I would
That's
agree.
what
I
I'm
would
saying.
agree.
Okay. So, all right, so where are we now?
For one thing, in E, we need to add the new category.
Yeah.
So, self-directed learning,
Self-directed learning,
so before and board certification.
Yeah, right.
right before board certification.
And I think it is a really important comment that Ms. Marks brought, and I know we talk about always rationale for reg packages. That piece about capping of numbers is an important one here because we still want to get to the goal of reducing professional isolation. So I think that was a great catch in terms of that math to do if we just do 2.
Well, thank you for Dr. Horn for doing the math for me. But I am still a little bit concerned about OAL questioning the consistency if you have the minimums but don't expressly say that the minimums only apply where you're engaging in that activity. Just so it's clear that where it says a minimum, a licensee is not required to gain that minimum. That's
Aren't we saying that?
I
What's
don't
your
think so. I
concern?
think where it says, for any activity for which credit is claimed, the licensee shall appear no less than 1 hour. But I want it to be clear that that the minimums don't mean that that's.
It's not a requirement.
That it's a requirement. That's all.
So in other words, OAL would want to know that we're communicating clearly in the regs
Right.
that people are not having to participate in
Every activity.
every activity.
Right.
But it
Instead
says,
of
for
using,
any activity for which credit is claimed, so we're not,
instead of using can be used in all of these examples, can we say can be credited? So that it's clear that they can take as much as they want or as little as they want, but a minimum of 1 shall be credited and a maximum of 18 hours, like for peer consultation, for example, can be credited. So instead of can be used, maybe say can be, shall be credited.
yeah.
So that way, the hours are applied, and it's clear that the hours are applied, but they can take as much as, or as little as they want. But we're
Can be
only going to
credited.
credit
Yeah.
a minimum of 1 and a maximum of whatever.
Well, I like that change in language. I don't know if that necessarily addresses what council was talking about, which is making it crystalline clear that they don't have to get hours in each activity.
So maybe we'll just add a sentence there, because as I read it, it still seems to me like they don't have to get it in each. So why don't we say, unless otherwise specified, for any activity for which the licensee wishes to claim credit. How about that? No less than 1 hour credit shall be accrued and no more than.
So go all the way to no less.
I think that's right.
Do you think that, okay?
But get rid of everything.
No, that doesn't matter.
Unless otherwise specified, for any activity for which licensee wishes to claim credit,
Licensee shall accrue
no less than 1 hour credit can be earned,
Well, no, we've already said they can only accrue no less than 1 hour.
can be accrued, and no more than the maximum number of hours allowed
wondering also, Ms. Marks, to address the question that you raised, would it be worthwhile putting for the total number of CPD hours? I mean, because I feel like the section about a licensee shall accrue hours during each renewal period from at least 2 of the categories for the total number or something would address that, because that means that you've got to get to the total number of hours. And I don't know if we want to put the number of hours, well, we do put the number of hours here. And then that would know that you don't have to get each category, because you finish when you reach your number required.
Can we do this just a second and then do that? Unless otherwise specified, for any activity for which a licensee wishes to claim credit, strike out a licensee shall accrue and say no less than 1 hour credit can be accrued and no more no less than 1 hour no less than 1 hour credit is acceptable. How about that? And no more than the maximum number of hours. Yeah.
It needs a per category or something.
Right,
That's
I think
numbers
that
of what?
if you take out the,
Yeah.
for any activity, that phrase may be moved down to the, after allowed. So no more than the maximum number of hours allowed for any activity for which the licensee wishes to claim credit. Or just allowed for that particular activity.
What does it say right now? A licensee shall receive no more credit than the maximum number of hours allowed per renewal period. So we want to say, shall receive no less than 1 hour and no more than the maximum number of hours. So instead of saying a licensee shall receive, no, how about this? No less than 1 hour credit and no more than the maximum number
No, it's not hours, allowable
credits.
How about can be used? How about used? The word used.
How about making it 2 sentences? Because I think we keep getting, again, kind of lost in
I mean, I do think if the question is about making sure people don't have to fit in any category, I think then you're saying, there's the end, if you do it out of the categories up to the point, or some kind of language around that, because I think I think it's a good question, but if that's the issue, we just want to make sure that once you hit your number that you have to hit, you're done.
Yeah.
Right?
Right.
whether you keep doing that or not.
You can still do it.
You still do it.
So how about this? Unless otherwise specified, for any activity for which a licensee wishes to claim credit, no less than 1 hour credit
Can be claimed.
and no more than the maximum number of hours noted per activity.
Noted per activity.
Or, for the number.
Can be
'cause-
credited?
Yeah, because it's per activity, can be credited. So it's maximum number of hours per activity. For any activity for which licensee wishes to claim credit, no less than 1 hour can be claimed and no more than the maximum number that we've described.
Yeah, I don't think we have to put it per activity again, because that's in the first
Yeah.
clause, right?
Right. no more than the maximum number of hours can be claimed,
Can be claimed.
period. And then say, can be claimed per renewal period or for each renewal period.
Are we still doing can be claimed period?
No, can be claimed
Per renewal period.
per renewal period or
What about for each
each renewal period. That's better.
Okay, that's better.
Can be claimed for each renewal period. And then everything else is gone. Salary there.
I like it.
Yeah.
You look like you
Maximum number of hours
Well, I think we, yeah.
that we've determined here can be claimed in no more than the maximum number of hours.
Do we need two can be claimed, or can we just simplify that to be no less than 1 hour credit and no more than the maximum number of hours can be claimed?
Well,
But
it's not the
allowable.
maximum, it's a maximum number of
How about
hours that
allowable?
we've determined.
Allowable hours.
Allowable hours. Maximum number of allowable hours, that's good, can be claimed for each renewal period?
Okay. And Ms. Jones and I were just talking off the record. I don't, Ms. Marks, does that address your concern?
I think it does, I think it does. I believe so.
Okay. Now, we're gonna read all through these, I think, again, just we're gonna wanna make sure everything is all right, but, okay, so we're all right there, right? We've said, can you go back to what, we want, what staff will need to, you know, what they need to verify, where do we have that?
One moment, if I may. Ms. Sark made a comment in F to change, under A, I believe it was to change credited from used to credited.
Yeah.
Is that, and that would have to be a global change for every,
Yeah.
and is that something that the committee wants to move forward with, and I can put a
Yes.
note to?
Yes.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you. Okay, so now we can just say a maximum of 18 hours can be credited in peer consultation. We don't have to say a minimum of 1 because we've already said it, right? Only when there is a different minimum do we have to say that. Okay. I'm sorry? Which one?
Like professional service, that's a minimum of 4.5 hours, so unless it says a minimum of 1, which already is in the preamble, yeah.
Okay, the last thing I think we need to do on this new D or E or whatever activity we're calling self-directed learning is just to, I just want to make sure that we have in there what is going to be used for verification.
And this is back on page.
It's I. On 10.
On 10?
Probably 11.
Okay. There we go. Credited. Maximum of 6 hours can be credited in self-directed learning. As long as we're there.
Yeah, try to get rid of a minimum of one.
Yeah.
I don't think we need a minimum of one.
That's what we're taking it out.
Oh,
Oh,
yeah.
To be credited. 1 hour of activity equals 1 hour credit. Licensee shall maintain a record of this activity to the board. The record shall include dates of something, or just a type of activity. What do we mean by type of activity?
If it is a webinar or webcast, and then we also had topic.
And then we want topic, yeah.
What, we want topics, we want titles?
Topic or title,
Okay.
yeah. And total number of hours.
But type of activity seems,
It's a
type
little
of
bit-
activity seems vague to me. I
It
wonder if we
does.
should put medium activity? So is it a journal, is it a
Yeah.
book, is it a webinar, is it a webcast, is it
Yeah.
a podcast?
What about adding EG?
You know, activity, e.g. webinar.
Yeah,
And I would envision some kind of checklist where we would do that too.
okay, yeah. For the thing that we're not mentioning.
Same.
No, good,
But
no,
in
that'll be
terms of
good, that'll be
this-
good for staff, it'll also be good that licensees can use, I mean, if they want
Check
to,
journal
yeah.
article,
Mhm.
put the title,
Right.
put the
Because we
date.
have type of activity in other categories as well, where we're not defining that, and who knows what it will be, and so it'll be that same kind of definition, I think.
Right, okay, good. All right, so now are we up to where, I mean, now we're gonna have to change this in several places. We now have 5 areas for activities. Do we need a definition of, or do we have our definition of self-directed learning? Okay, all right,
Really quick, this is on.
I'm sorry.
I'll just project. I don't know why this didn't get changed, but just to make sure, for example, under F, I think, acceptable CBE learning is under self-directed learning. Is that F? I can't read it.
That's an I.
Or I, wow. Where it says 1 hour of activity in such and such equals 1 hour, it should be 1 hour credited, correct?
1 hour
Not-
credited is
Not a
fine.
credit.
Yeah.
Right, okay, so we need to just make a global change for those.
Well, we have that same way too, like in other sections.
Yeah, there are some that are like that too.
So
Yeah.
of supervision, so.
Okay, great, thanks. All right, so this will be good for you? You got that, all
That's
right,
good.
so. All right, so.
I actually don't think that should change. I think it should be 1 hour of credit.
Of credit?
Because then you get credited the number of hours, but you're you're defining what the variable is.
Yeah, 1 hour of.
It's 1 hour of credit actually,
Back to
because it's like a 1 hour. Then you're credited if you satisfy
Good
so
point.
many
Yeah,
activities.
that's right, good. Okay, so we want to make that consistent
Revert.
throughout too, so.
We're back.
So unless we hear anything else, are we, well, there's a question, wait a minute, is this where we are, or? No, let's see. No, it's right after. So unless there's anything else in what we've already covered, I think we're ready to move on to what we haven't yet covered. Is that, okay.
And since she's not here with us today, I would like to thank Dr. Shore for highlighting this issue for us.
Great, yeah, thanks. If she gets here later, we can thank her in person, so. All right, now we are on page 11, on J, which is now, I guess, K. On sponsor-approved continuing education courses, or whatever we said we were gonna call them in the meantime.
Approved continuing education?
Yes.
Approved continuing education. Okay.
Placeholder.
Approved, formal, yeah, we're just, whatever. So this is how we're going to approve the entity to approve
Provider.
the provider or the sponsor. Okay. And there's a question here in blue from staff.
What page
This is page 11. Who is going to be reviewing and approving these approving organizations?
So is that K? It's K
Yes,
Yeah,
instead of I,
yes. Instead of J.
yeah.
instead of J.
And now, and number 1, under that, who's going to be approving them? And I think that's the board. Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay, so, it's been demonstrated to the board, it says that there, and that's, so anybody who comes and wants to be one of these approving organizations, they have to come before the board.
And when we use Cap B board, if I'm
Yes.
correct, that's referring to the actual formal board of 9 people or less.
Yes. All right, so let's look at these requirements now. We went over these, this was a while ago, but you know that we did, so let's just make sure that they're things that we. And we're already saying an organization that was previously approved is staying approved. They don't have to do anything more to us. And that's the organizations that.
APA, CPA, CME, and what's the fourth one?
ACC.
ABCI.
ACC. Oh, and ABC.
Okay.
And ABC.
May I ask a question?
And I just want to be sure that I'm understanding. So on page 11, under K, right at the very beginning, it says, to satisfy the requirements of section 2915 of the code, approved or whatever, continuing education courses shall meet the following requirements.
You're right, it's not the courses.
So it's not courses, right? It's,
You're right.
what's it?
Sponsored continuing education, or whatever we end up calling it.
Approved, but that's beside the point. Approved continuing education, what? And this is to Ms. Jones' point earlier. What is the term that is in, that you've decided on
This
for organizations like us that are approved bodies to approve?
So, yeah, because this isn't the courses now. We're talking about, to satisfy the requirements, the sponsors or the approving organizations must meet these requirements.
Right, but what is the term?
Approving organization?
But we've called it in here are organizations approved by the board to provide or sponsor.
Right, but is there a term for who, is there a term for what we are?
Yeah.
I just want to read from our current sunset extension bill in 29, just so we're consistent with the language of
Right.
the statute. In 2915, it says, continuing education courses taken pursuant to this subdivision shall be applied to the 36 hours of approving continuing professional development required under subdivision A. Continuing education courses approved to meet the requirements of this section shall be approved by organizations approved by the board. So that's new language. currently in SB 1194.
Would you read that again, because say it again?
So continuing education courses approved to meet the requirements of this section shall be approved by organizations approved by the board. An organization previously approved by the board to provide or approves continuing education is deemed approved under this section. You get $5 every time you say approved.
You
I know.
can provide or approve.
But it says approving organizations.
Oh.
Could you read the first part of it first?
And then it
Yes.
says in F, the board may accept sponsored continuing education courses that have been approved by a private nonprofit organization that has demonstrated to the board in writing that it has at minimum a 10-year history of providing educational programming for psychologists and has documented procedures for maintaining a continuing education approval program. The board shall adopt regulations as necessary for implementing this section.
Because if I understand the conversation we had earlier, the approving organizations, the approved approving organizations, whatever we're calling them, approves the CE provider or sponsor,
Right.
and they in turn approve the course.
Right, the particular.
Right.
The way the statute reads is the course is being approved by the approving organization.
Right, I really regret that we didn't notice this before. But we, this is not semantics, this is actual substantive,
Law.
yeah, and practice. So, we've, yeah. Because courses are not approved individually by, for example, the providers that CPA approves are responsible for their courses. So that's true. They approve the courses. But what we used to call accrediting bodies, which we don't call us that anymore, but approval bodies, let's just, for the next 5 minutes, use approval bodies. Approval bodies don't approve individual courses. So again, it's really important, especially with statutory language, that we are very careful about what we say. Or we'll end up in a place where there'll be a statute that doesn't reflect reality, or we'll all have to start approving individual courses again to meet the statute. And we don't want that. Thankfully, it's not in statute yet, but it's getting close.
And it does seem the first sentence conflicts with the last sentence. I mean, the way it's
Right.
worded, it seems like it's not that, you know.
Well, this has always been a problematic section in the current regs. Part of what some of you have alluded to has always been problematic because it was sort of piecemeal. And so what was in statute at one time and then was in regulation, and then you moved from statute to regulation and back, and it was very confusing. And it was inconsistent, as some of you have pointed out. Even now, it's inconsistent. So this is a chance to make sure that it's correct. This section is problematic and has generated a lot of conversation at the board level, because you are talking about, as I understand it, the criteria that you will establish for organizations that want to be listed as approval bodies. And that's the goal of this part. And so that list of 4 that Ms. Noonan read off, this is for what if somebody else comes and says, I want to be in that group. I want you to automatically accept anything that we offer, and we want the right also to approve other organizations to offer courses. We want to be listed in that group with APA and CPA and ACCME and ABAP. So am I right that that's what this is? And ABCI's in that group already?
Mhm.
Okay, so that's what this is. So we really do need to be very careful about use of the word courses. And,
Well, this isn't about the courses. This is
Right.
really about the agencies
Right.
that the board is saying,
The approving
that
bodies.
approving entity, yes. Yeah.
But we do now have a statutory problem.
Yes. we do.
yes, we do. And it's significant because it really changes the whole nature of,
Continuing ed.
yeah, right.
Whatever we're calling it.
It changes the whole nature of what approval bodies do. So when the board opted to eliminate MCEP, in that action, we also eliminated the approval of individual courses. That whole system was eliminated, and so the whole system is different now. And I think part of the issue is probably that we tried to work with old language that was appropriate under that old system, and the system has changed, and now the language hasn't caught up with it. So I'm not sure that it's going to take a bit of work, I would say, to get this right. And good luck with that.
We look forward to your assistance.
Oh, boy. All righty, guys. The very first part is incorrect. Of K. It's not courses that have to meet the following requirements.
It's not courses.
It is organizations that wish to approve
Or provide CE.
or provide CE. Okay.
And then,
I mean, approve groups or other groups to provide CE, so they can approve they can approve providers, or they can
or they could also.
provide it themselves, offer it themselves. This is about those organizations and how they get approval, what makes them get approval from the board.
So it'd be an organization seeking no, it's not accreditation, it's not approval, because they're approving bodies, we're gonna get our language.
Yeah.
And if I'm not mistaken, we've had this conversation from public comment where people have come and said, you know, we have conferences that are outside of those for approval or whatever, recognized agencies is what Ms. Newman
That's
said.
how we did ABCI, actually.
And so, yeah, so basically, yeah.
All righty. So,
So get rid of the word courses.
Yes.
yeah,
Okay.
Yeah.
How does it look?
How does this look?
it's not the education itself that is okay. So, organizations that wish to approve other providers or provide continuing education themselves shall meet the following requirements. How does that help, Dr. Lindergren?
Again, I think intent is really important here. So if you if you say that organizations that wish to offer continuing education courses, I don't think you want to say that because you aren't in the business of approving providers.
No, but that's,
So the way you just worded it, that's what it sounded like. So again, I think that maybe the first thing that would be helpful is to decide on terminology that you want to use for organizations like CPA and ABSI and APA and ABAP. Decide on what we should be called. Because it's not just that we want to offer CE courses.
right,
We want to be approval bodies
right,
for continuing education.
right.
So there has to be, I think, a term to use in this section that will set that aside and make that clear. And I don't think you want to say that wish to offer CE courses, because that could be hundreds of organizations want to offer CE courses.
But we also don't want to take away your ability as an organization to offer CE.
No, that's true.
But they can approve themselves.
Exactly.
Yeah,
Yeah,
so we don't
that's
have to
true.
worry about that.
Yes, that's
Yeah.
true. So
So-
the term, and I don't think, I agree that, I don't think accrediting body is the right thing, because we don't accredit anything.
Organization. just
CE
org-
approval organizations, or,
No, you actually said it earlier, organizations that wish to, what did you say? It was the organizations that wish to do what?
approve providers of continuing
That's
education.
it. That's how we should start it. Organizations.
So you could say something like, to satisfy the requirements of section 2915 of the
Right.
code.
Organizations. that
Organizations
wish to approve providers.
wishing to, seeking approval, organizations seeking approval
Seeking approval.
to approve
providers.
providers of continuing, of formal, and then use that whatever term you end up with, to approve providers of formal continuing education or whatever. I know it gets wonky.
I think seeking the authority to approve.
Yeah,
provides-
Seeking the authority to approve,
That's-
yes, that's
very
good. Yes, seeking the authority to approve providers of continuing education.
Yep.
Shall meet the following requirements.
We want to take out or.
Or
provide
something.
Continuing education themselves.
Yeah, I would take that out.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Although I think what came up in our stakeholder meeting with you guys and ABSI was that you may provide CE and also approve providers of CE. So I want to make sure
Right.
we,
Then maybe there could be, I agree, maybe there could be a separate sentence
Yeah.
that organizations approved under this da-da-da
May provide.
may also provide
That's
continuing
good.
education,
Good.
Good effort.
or something like that. And that would cover that, because I agree, that needs to be specified so that there's not a question about that.
I think second sentence.
so it could say, organizations approved pursuant to this section may also provide continuing education?
I think we should say organizations
Yeah.
authorized pursuant to this
Yeah.
section.
Authorized, yeah.
May also provide continuing education themselves.
No, it may also. provide
Just say,
continuing
just
education, period.
say provide, yeah.
Because it's the emphasis on provide. Okay, good. Here is-
And that-
Organization previously approved by the board, authorized by the board.
Are determined, are deemed to be authorized under this section.
Okay.
I think authorized is a good word because that's what it means.
vesting
Yes,
authority
the
in-
board has authorized us to do this,
Yeah.
yeah.
Previously authorized by the board to,
Provide or approve CE is deemed approved under this section. Is deemed authorized under this section.
Yeah, authorized under this section. And I believe that's,
provide or approve providers of CE. It's not approved, right?
where's that?
An organization previously authorized by the board to.
Under the pursuant to this section,
To approve, provide.
I think is what Ms. Sorick offered.
Oh, yeah, say that again.
Organizations previously authorized by the board pursuant to this section are deemed authorized, no.
May also-
Previously approved by the board. No, previously
Organizations
authorized.
Previously authorized by the board pursuant to this section may also provide CE.
Now, that's-
Well, you've got two concepts. You want to say that those organizations previously authorized are sort of grandfathered or deemed authorized.
Right.
That wouldn't be pursuant to the section.
Yeah, right,
Okay.
right.
They're not approving CE, they're approving providers
Of continuing
of
education.
continuing education or providing themselves. So in other words, we're saying you can approve providers of continuing education. And so we want to say an organization previously authorized by the board to do what we've said above is deemed authorized under this section.
Yeah,
To approve providers?
Yeah.
To approve providers, yeah,
To approve providers
of continuing
of
education.
continuing education.
Is deemed authorized under this section?
Are.
yes. An organization previously authorized by the board to approve providers of CE is deemed, or you could say organizations, because there are more than one already.
I would say just organizations, take the N out. No, just,
Yeah, to say organizations previously authorized by the board to approve providers of CE are deemed authorized under this section.
okay.
At that point.
And then you can add that other sentence that organizations authorized under this section may also offer continuing
Yeah,
education.
that second sentence.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's good.
Okay, that looks good.
Well, that part does.
Yeah, you mean those five lines? Yes. But this is really good and a very important clarification, very good part. So,
All right, so now, is that right? Ms. Jones, you okay? Okay. Okay, so now, what are we saying here? Sponsored CE courses must have been approved by a private, non-governmental, that is in your history. So that doesn't make sense the way it goes. I think we have to say, to satisfy the requirements, there shall meet the following requirements. So sponsored CE courses are not the following requirement. The organization
Yeah.
has a 10-year history of providing educational programming. Is it a private nonprofit organization? It's not necessarily, is
Not
it?
necessarily.
So I think, huh? I don't think there's any reason why we particularly want it to be, do you? I mean, to make it a nonprofit organization or a private nonprofit organization, Dr. Emos? Yeah.
Marilyn Emos from CDCR. Could it be a governmental organization?
Sure.
Or a state hospital?
Yeah.
Or- Uh-huh.
Yeah, which would be, that would be a nonprofit.
yeah, that would be a governmental entity.
Right.
So let's not specify what kind of organization, maybe.
You could just say, in order to be authorized, organizations must.
Have a 10-year history, da-da-da-da-da-da. So that, let's take out this sponsored CE courses must have been approved by.
So take out that and put in,
In order to be authorized,
Mm-hmm.
sponsored,
Yeah.
or
Must
approved
meet the
continuing
following
education.
criteria or
Or are we
something.
saying that, or-
In order to be authorized by the board to,
Just under this section, or?
the
Approve.
following requirements must be met?
Yeah. to approve providers of continuing education, the following requirements must be met.
Well, we're saying it twice then, we're saying it in the first
Yeah.
sentence of K, and we're saying it in one, so.
Shall meet the following requirements. Yeah, so take one out, and then just, now one is it has a history. Do we want to do that? Or.
Or the criteria,
such-
the criteria are as
Yeah, let's say
follows.
the criteria,
Mhm.
yeah.
Is that one, the criteria or? following?
Yeah,
Couldn't it just be a sentence under that, and then 1, 2, 3, 4, 5?
Don't ask me.
let's say the criteria are as follows, period, the organization, colon. Or we could just say the organization, colon, and leave out the criteria are as follows.
The organization must.
Must, now we have to change has to have, but.
So are we leaving the criteria or as well?
No.
No, the
Say
organization.
organization must have a 10-year history, have documented have policies in place, must evaluate, I'm just changing this part, and if there's anything. No, evaluate.
You said must evaluate.
Well,
You don't want that.
no, I just want us to say, because we've already said must up there, evaluate, I was just repeating what was at the top. Okay.
So have, maintain, manage, monitor, approve.
No,
You want to make them consistent?
no, because maintain and monitor follows.
Bless you.
Oh, got it, we're okay there. But have, evaluate, so everything needs to be.
But that's if we stick with just organization, to make it match subject.
Right.
Because I definitely go back to what Dr. Linda Crow just said. I think there, we need to insert an adjective to what this organization is. So it's the organization's approving providers or something. We've got to, I think,
We've said that up there, that's why we took it out.
well,
Because if they may approve and they may also provide.
and I'm only looking ahead because of the sections. We have the 1, 2, and the 3 for different things here. And so I just feel like in terms of, because then for number 2, we say the approving organizations.
Right.
And I feel like if we're starting off from ground zero here, whatever we're gonna call these things, so we say we have this, whatever it is, I think we should just be consistent, because we get into providers.
Okay. So the approving organization must?
Or something.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. We'll start there and
Because it's
kind of
always
see how it does,
consistent,
yeah.
yeah.
Okay. Do these sound all right? Okay. So then let's go on to E, conduct. F, establish. And G, have.
I think E gets to that issue of folks, organizations in this category that would also provide their own CE, correct?
Mm-hmm. Okay, so then number 2 under there, we've already said approving organizations, so that's good. Shall ensure that approved providers, whoever they're approving.
And then again, I think we would want to be consistent, either we're going to say the approved organization in one, or it's going to be plural or singular in both of them. You know how you just changed the subject verb in one?
Mhm.
It should be the same, I think, for here.
So it should be approving organization.
The, or
Well,
the.
that's what we have.
No, no, no. If go back up to one, please, Mr. Lassbegal. You say the approving organization, when we get to number 2, we
Oh,
should probably
just
say.
approving
the
organizations. Yeah.
Or keep it singular, but we gotta do the same for number 2 is all I was just
Yeah.
offering.
Yeah.
I think it actually,
Well, take out the F, wait.
take out the S.
singular?
Take out the S.
Because you're talking about one.
The approving organization
Now we have to go back to
must.
has, don't we? Oh, no,
Must have, yeah,
must
that's
have,
right.
that's right.
Okay, going down, then we want to say the approving organization shall.
So do you want the or
Yeah.
just approving?
The approving. Approved providers, okay. And then this should all read all right.
Yeah, should, because.
Mhm. Then I think we're all right. I don't think we want to say approval may be, authorization may be revoked by the board. Isn't that what we're doing? We're authorizing.
Number 3.
Number 3, all the way down.
Approval may be revoked by the board. Authorization.
Authorization may
Authorization
be-
may be approved.
May be
Revoked
revoked.
by the board,
Yeah.
right.
Authorization of approving.
Yeah, authorization of approving organizations.
Yeah, may be revoked by the board for good cause. Good.
I know it's better.
Huh?
We did approve, approving organization.
You can put an and approving organization if you want to keep it.
Of an approving organization. Thank you, Jason. May be revoked by the board for good cause.
That's a good question.
Well, so Ms. Mark said, and the process for doing that is what?
I don't know, Ms. Marks, what is it?
So what would we do? We'd get complaints? Complaints would come in some kind of way? I mean, what is the process? I mean, we don't have every process written down, but I mean, you know.
But what's good cause?
What's good cause, yeah. We start getting complaints, do we have to define all that?
You know, it could be potentially good cause could be the failure to meet the requirements that have been set out. The question is, are you going to be having a hearing before the board? Is it after notice?
Do we need to do that in statute
Do we have
as
to
opposed to
put that
regulation?
here?
Oh, these are
our regs.
regulations, that's
These are our
right.
regs.
See it?
There's a current regulation that states failure of the entity to substantially comply with the provisions as set forth in subdivision F shall constitute cause for revocation of recognition by the board. Recognition can be revoked only by a formal board action after notice and hearing and for good cause.
That's good.
Is that
We want to include that?
Does that sound good? Read that again. Do we have it here
Let me see if we have.
in our old language? I don't think we
It would
do,
be,
do we?
6-1.
And 6.
Well, if you just, what page is it on?
It's on page, top of page 150.
150?
Right.
So we would want to say failure of the approving organization.
Oh, is that,
Well, we can add it.
no, it's effective, oh, sorry, inoperative. You're right.
Okay,
That's
so
the one.
where are we? It's good language, we can still use the language.
For some reason. Use the old definitions.
Repurposing.
See, that's what you just recycle something.
Could I ask a question?
Yes.
So to your point about what what good cause would be. So if you look at number 2,
Number 2,
yes, where it says the providing organization shall ensure that approved providers, and then it lists, it really, these are the criteria that were lifted from the MCEP regs. These are the criteria that we use, basically. I think these were basically taken from our criteria that we say that our providers, our approved providers have to meet. So to your point about how would the board evaluate organizations that you have approved to approve, that you've authorized to approve providers. You've listed what we as an authorized organization has to do. And I suppose that if you got complaints that, we have a complaint procedure in place. So if one of our approved providers offers a program and someone's unhappy, they know that they can complain to us. So I suppose that the next level up would be that they would complain to the board about the fact that CPA was an authorized organization by the Board of Psychology, and that we were, and that we or another organization were not following the criteria that were laid out by the board. In other words, I attended this program, I complained to them, they didn't do anything about it. I don't think that they are holding their own approved providers up to the criteria that you have laid out here. So that I think you do have the criteria here for how you would go about judging whether or not an authorized organization was doing what you wanted them to do or not. So to answer your, Ms. Mark's question, now the process, that's a different story. But I think you have the criteria laid out here, and then the process of what you would do if you got a complaint is another matter.
thank you. So maybe if we took that language and said failure of the entity or the approving organization, I wouldn't say substantially comply, I'd say to comply. With the provisions as set forth above, whatever we say, shall constitute cause for revocation of authorization by the board and recognition or authorization by the board, or authorization can be revoked only by a formal board action after notice and hearing and for good cause.
I took a hybrid of that and tried to simplify it a little bit, so get rid of the first sentence, Jason.
This one?
Yeah. So, let me start there.
Okay. Only by formal board action after notice and hearing and.
I think we should change recognition to authorization,
Yeah,
just for
authorization,
clarity.
not recognition. Because we're authorizing, not recognizing, so.
But I like it otherwise.
So both authorization.
Yeah. And authorization at the second sentence. Yeah, perfect. Hey, we're just. Okay, y'all, this is great. So is there any more discussion from anybody about this part? I'm noticing it's 5:12. It might be a good time to break for lunch. We're getting ready to hit this next section. So. Is this a good time to take a break? Anybody got anything else to say? Then why don't we take a break for lunch and come back at 1 o'clock? 1:05? 1:05? All right, we're on break till 1:05. We're going to go back in session for the afternoon, and just want to kind of outline how we want to move forward for the afternoon. So we're just about through with the CPD, all the regs pertaining to CPD. What I'd like for us to do is go ahead and finish the CPD regs with, again, people commenting on each section or each page as we move along, the way we've been doing it, basically. And then when we're done with this, and I do anticipate we will be done today, to call for any additional public comments or any additional comments. So I just want to let y'all know, those of you in the public who do want to speak, that's when I'll call for comments on the CPD reg package, anything that y'all want to talk about, okay? So, and then depending on what time it is, we may go back to pathways to licensure. All right. So, where we are now is on page 12. What's here listed is number K. So this is the one that I've actually just X'd out because it refers to forms which we don't want to put in regulation, and we don't want to define anything, but to me, the essential elements that are there in K is that the licensee needs to maintain documentation as described in the regs, like whatever numbers they are, and that they need to keep their documentation for 4 years and submit it to the board upon request. That's the important things out of that section. So I think we have to have a way to say that. Unless y'all have.
That sounded really good.
It seems like that last sentence at least covers that last part you were just talking about.
Right, a licensee shall retain verification, well, we're not going to say verification logs, but.
Yes.
Retain supporting documentation, yeah, for a minimum of 4 years following the renewal, and shall submit documentation to the board upon request. Following the renewal, so this is what is the renewal?
The renewal of the license.
I'm sorry?
Each renewal.
Yeah. Following each renewal, thanks. So how about a licensee shall document completion of CPD activities. A licensee shall maintain documentation of CPD activities as prescribed in the above regs, or as prescribed in
The section?
yes, such and such section of the regs. That sound on the wrong person. I keep looking over there at Karen, but it's.
I have the language that the board approved to be included in SB 1194. There might be some language here we can use. It says, each person who applies to renew or reinstate his or her license issued pursuant to this chapter shall certify under penalty of perjury that he or she is in compliance with this section and shall retain proof of this compliance for submission to the board upon request.
Okay. So are we gonna have a place on the application for people to say, I've done this by, under penalty of perjury? Is that how we do it right now?
Yeah, it'll
Our
be one of the
CPD,
renewal
I think that is,
questions.
so it'll be one of our
Mhm.
renewal questions?
Yep.
That sounds
That sounds good to me. The only thing that's different from what you just read is there was the 4-year period. Do we need to have that?
Yeah, and then we'll add that sentence, yeah, right, because that would
That
change
covered
that.
something.
You're right, you're right.
But I don't know if 4 was a magic number for a particular reason.
It's basically 2
Of the bill?
licensing cycles.
It's
Are you reading the?
page 3 of 6 of today's law as amended. It's section 2915B.
And then you got your cookies. No, you got your cookies. This is my best friend. You trying to kill me?
Do you want to kind of do a hybrid and say, like, a licensee shall retain supporting, well, let's see. A licensee shall certify under penalty of perjury that he or she is in compliance with this section and shall retain proof of this compliance for a minimum of 4 years
Following each renewal?
and shall submit proof to the board upon request?
Very good.
So 4 years following its renewal. Is that what we're saying?
Yeah.
So after 4 years, just add following each renewal.
For 4 years,
Oh, I don't know. Do you need following each renewal, you think?
Well, it has to be 4 years from something,
it's got,
Right.
yeah,
Right.
so we're gonna say from each renewal.
or 4 years from the date of
Because it's when they
certification.
use it, it's not,
Right.
so. For 4 years from each renewal. And shall submit to the board capitalized. Is it proof?
Proof of this compliance for submission to the board upon request. That's how it is in statute, that might work here.
I have 2 versions. So we'll
Shall
I
maintain
have
proof of
this
this
compliance
compliance
right
for
here.
4 years and shall submit proof, submit this,
Such proof to the board upon
Such proof.
request?
yeah. That's it.
So is that taking the place of K?
Yeah, that's our
Yes, it
intention.
is, yeah.
Yeah.
In K, it does say that the board makes the final determination of if that works.
I guess we would ultimately, but I think if we have a good enough checklist for Jackie or staff.
Well, I think that was
If there's
in
anything
lieu
they
of
have a question mark about.
not having a better description that you guys have worked out
Right.
now.
Okay.
Because before you didn't have for each one the maximum, the minimum, the coursework or whatever, and how to document the activity. So now you have that in the regs, you don't have to spell it out.
I'd like to suggest we say 4 years from the date of each renewal.
Yeah,
That doesn't make sense to
from
me.
the day, yeah, that's.
The date of each renewal.
Or date of renewal.
The date
Just-
of renewal.
Where do we get the
Yeah,
4
yeah.
years from? Just curious.
I have no idea.
Do we need 4 years? I mean, is that?
No, because, we would have the authority to audit not just the most recent renewal period, but one before that, but we don't do that. It's just two, yeah, it's just two licensing, but we
It's
don't
just
do
two
that.
licensing. I think we ought to
Currently.
say each renewal.
So we can only do
because
2 years.
Otherwise,
Maybe that's where that four came
you know, it's,
Before you-
because
oh, the
it's,
previous 2 years.
okay,
I'm going to,
it counts for the renewal that you're doing.
I'm going to recommend that it be at least 4 renewals, I mean, 4 years, at least 2 renewal periods, because not, in addition to the board's auditing or whatever you're going to do specifically for CE, if the board wants to look at documentation, because there's been a complaint filed about the licensee, and you want to look to see if it's something that it's in their area of expertise, and they say they've had a course in it, that kind of thing, I would think that you would want at least that.
Correct.
Person question, your reading stages or license. Why does this section shall maintain this compliance for 4 years from the date of?
Renewal, which is, yeah, I think so.
Do we need to specify that it's the renewal in which they took the education?
It's a renewal that they submitted it for.
From the
So
date of
I-
the relevant renewal?
No, I think
It shouldn't be K, it's
the date
it's new, I
of
think
each
it's
renewal cycle.
now L, because
But
I
that
think it
makes
was
it sound like
K.
4 years,
Yeah.
it's getting refreshed every time there's a renewal, as opposed to
Well, it does.
Well, it does.
It's a new 4 years.
for new documentation,
For
not
new
the old
document.
documentation.
Right.
When you say 4 years from the date of each renewal, it sounds like every time you renew your license, you still got 4 years to hold on to all the documentation from the past. That's what it sounds like.
Yes, it's been submitted.
What?
You could,
Renewal for which it's been submitted.
Okay.
yeah, yeah,
Oh, yeah,
that sounds good.
From the date of,
lawyers are so.
some of, even clients.
She's stealing my thunder.
So 4 years from the date of renewal for which it has been
I
submitted.
think it's L now, because I think the one previous is K. I think this is now.
Right.
It is.
And then
No, not to Jason, I think that's all.
Jason, there should be letter L.
The date
It should be
of
letter L.
the
No, but if
renewal
there's
for
other,
which
you
it is
changed it to K, I believe.
Okay, that,
Yeah.
that's what we'll change to a green number.
Oh,
Yeah. From the date of the renewal for which it is being
Nice. Okay,
and shall submit such provision
The board upon request.
very nicely done. You did something.
Correct. We've said what it's gotta be in each section. We've said what the documentation is.
Wait, but what's the question? What's the,
Maureen's
She was
dubious
looking
about
for
the
our
document.
forms.
We don't have any.
No.
Well, Maureen, would you suggest we have a form in the regulation?
Only if you want to require one. I mean, if you're going to require it, the question is whether or not you would like to see some standardization, so that when the staff is reviewing it, they have some kind of, standardization for what they're looking for.
So they're going to, that's gonna come next, but we're gonna create a form, but we don't want it in regulation. And
So
we
it's
want
going to be a
to,
voluntary form?
correct. Yeah. We're gonna, I think we can supply forms, I mean, this is my thinking. We can put them on the website or whatever we wanna do. This is a form you can use if you'd like to. You know, that'll make it a little bit easier, but I think the way we've documented what they need to turn in, I think it'll be, I think it'll be all right for y'all to read the way we're documenting it. But I think we probably do want to create a forms for y'all and forms for licensees, you know, just to make it
so,
easier.
so I have a question, because what now, I have slight confusion. Because I'm just thinking, and I know that we don't want to, because we're not ready to talk about it anyway today, the form, the log. But it does feel like if you're going back a couple cycles, having that required form would make it slightly easier for staff to then be able to confirm.